Are these stories real? Please, you tell us. What I mean is, did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot, and I've got an extra long extravaganza of Dogman for you today. And the entire package is brought to you by our newest executive producer, Megara Oppheim. Megara, ancient Grecian fury, more powerful than a grand jury. She comes from beyond all space and time. She's our new EP, Megara Oppheim. Please join us in thanking Megara Oppheim, today's executive producer, for making this extra long episode possible. And if you'd like to help us stay online with new episodes, you can join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Either way, you'll get access to our all-new secret uncensored stories, which we release each Sunday evening. Stories far too wild to ever tell on this channel. Autumn brings the willies. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was a boy, we commonly accepted the existence of Dogman, or at least one kind of Dogman. This was because we saw them all the time. When I say them, I mean we had 3 Dogmen who would run in a pack. To be clear, the first few sightings we had were only of the largest of the animals. We couldn't believe we were looking at a werewolf, my brother and I. He would be there in the shadows in the trees behind the house at night, and we were pretty certain we could see him. We took a picture, though, and saw nothing in it. That made us doubt our own eyes. Maybe it was a trick of light and shadow when we weren't really seeing the thing there. It didn't just happen one night, but pretty much every second or third night, once the leaves started turning colors in autumn. My brother and I took to calling the shadow illusion of a werewolf Willie the werewolf. One Saturday, my brother Joe and I were joking around about Willie over breakfast, and my father asked, "Who's that?" Joe, who is the older of us, told him it was an optical illusion of a werewolf that we could see outside our window at night, but only on some nights. Dad was intrigued and wanted to know on what kinds of nights we would see it. We both looked at each other and shrugged, since we had no idea what conditions were required for the werewolf illusion to appear. Just on some nights, you could swear that there was an upright, standing, dog-headed, hairy man-like beast standing out there. Except it couldn't actually be there, because werewolves don't exist. Dad told us he wanted us to let him know the next time Willie was there. When we got Dad and brought him back to our room that night, we quietly pointed out where we thought the shadows combined to really look like a werewolf-type entity was actually standing down there. At first, Dad saw nothing out of the ordinary, and he started growing annoyed that we had gotten him out of bed. But then, he gasped and moved himself back into shadow before whispering 5 words to us that changed all our lives, including Mom's. And those 5 words were, "There are 3 of them." The next day, Dad brought us all to the mall, and we got ourselves a motion-activated camera. We went over to the area where we had seen the one Dogman and where our dad had seen the other 2, and we found a tree to attach the camera to. It would give us a good view of the place where the creature or creatures seemed to stand at night. We hoped this would answer the question for us of whether this was just light and shadow creating illusions, or if we really did have nighttime visitors on our property. Well, that was the end of them hanging out in that spot. Either the light had changed to no longer create the illusion of creatures, or else the creatures themselves were avoiding the camera as though they knew what it was. We had been planning a Halloween party, but Dad didn't feel like it would be right since we might be placing our guests in danger. We weren't sure if the werewolves were real or not yet, and we didn't know what they were capable of. I told some of my better friends the truth about why we were canceling, but that only made them want to be at our place on Halloween even more. Two of them appealed directly to my mother, who had not seen the werewolves herself, and thought that we were making a big thing out of nothing. She said of course they could sleep over. She didn't understand why her husband had canceled the party in the first place. So, after trick-or-treating that year, my brother and I and about 5 of our friends retired to the back room in my house that we hardly ever used. We had a couch and some chairs back there, and that, coupled with our candy haul, was all the party we needed. We kept the lights off in the room so that we could see out into the backyard and the trees past it. We wanted to see one or more of the Dogmen, but we didn't really want them to see us. So, we spent a couple of hours in the dark telling each other creepy stories and staring out into the dark night, wondering if there were real-life monsters out there. We watched out that window like we were watching TV that night. I think our generation had better attention spans or something. At one point, we all saw it. Something large ran from behind one tree to behind another. It was so fast it was like a lightning flash, but we all saw it, and one of my brother's friends stood up, shouted an expletive, and ran upstairs to hide in the bathroom. I'm not even joking. It was kind of funny at the time, at least to me and Joe. The others had just seen the first monster of their lives, and they looked like they had seen a ghost. One of them said he wanted to go home, but his brother said no way he was going outside until the sun was up. We all agreed. We were probably safe, as long as we stayed inside. Hopefully the Dogmen wouldn't be so brash as to invade a human dwelling. We all went up to the room I shared with my brother, which was lined with sleeping bags all over the floor for the guys. We felt safer up there, and nobody wanted a second glimpse of one of the monsters that soon. They were still processing the first sighting. Some of the guys were saying that the thing had devil legs. I thought they looked like dog legs, or at least dog's hind legs. The top half of the thing looked more like a man though, which is why we all thought of it as a werewolf. We didn't really see the face, but we saw the dog-like profile of the head. We saw the upright pointy ears on top too. My brother and I kept catching glimpses of the werewolves outside our window over the years. We eventually came to the conclusion that Dad was right. There were actually 3 of them. There was the large one, and 2 that were about my father's size. We at first thought one of the smaller ones might be the mate of the large one, but we never saw any gender-identifying characteristics on any of them. I suppose female dogs would be obvious if they stood upright and you could see their mammary glands on their chest and belly, but we saw nothing of the kind, so maybe they were a father and 2 sons. Then again, maybe the mammary glands are less obvious on this species and they could have all been females, I just don't know. We called them the willies, which was a name that fit and stuck. They certainly gave people the willies. By spring, they were gone. We didn't really notice they were gone till the summer, but they came back in the autumn. Each year, Halloween season meant the cat couldn't be let out anymore because it was too dangerous out there. Halloween season in my neighborhood meant the return of the willies. My mother passed on a couple of years ago, and my brother and I went out to stay at the old house together for the first time in over a decade. Dad had left us in the early 2000s, but Mom had stayed on in the old house alone afterward. Both Joe and I had so many memories in that house, so many things we'd been relying on our mother to hold on to for us. Now, we had to take stock of our own stuff. We had to decide what to keep and what to throw out. We had to decide what to do with the house. It was quite painful, as I don't think either of us were ready to let go. I slept in our old room, but Joe slept down in the back room on the couch. I knew why he was doing that. He wanted to see if the willies were still there after all those years. I thought he was crazy. 40 years had passed since the first time we saw them. How old do werewolves or dogmen live to be anyway? If they were still alive, They would probably be very old poochies by now. Neither of us discussed any of this. We didn't have to. At around midnight, I heard Joe running downstairs, and I suspected I knew what was happening. I thought about getting out of bed and going downstairs, but then I heard him running up the staircase to come to me. Out of breath, finding those stairs not as easy to climb when you're in your 50s, my brother burst into our old bedroom and announced, "They're still here!" I went back downstairs with him, but there was nothing to see by then, so Joe gave me the play-by-play of what had happened. "They ran by," he said, staring out the window at the darkness. "That's it?" I asked. "It was all three of them," he told me. I wanted to know what they looked like, and he said they looked exactly the same. Nothing at all had changed about them in all those years. I told him that was impossible. He told me werewolves are impossible. I couldn't argue his point. Both my brother and I moved back into the old house. I've seen the willies myself since then. Joe was right. They look the same. Or else, maybe these are their offspring and just look the same to us humans. I can't say for sure, but it does look like the originals are still out there. My brother's wife thinks Joe is avoiding adulthood by chasing his childhood monsters. I would agree with her, except I've seen them too. They're really there. I could tell you a whole lot more stories about the willies, and I bet some of the best stories are yet to come. So, you guys, enjoy your Halloween season, but always be careful out there in the night. Remember, autumn brings the willies. Oh my golly, oh my gosh, this show comes courtesy of Josh. Yes, our executive producer of the day is Josh. I saw Dogman leap a moving car. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I just experienced the most terrifying night of my life, and it's all because of this Dogman running past. Well, I mean, it had already been a hard luck kind of a day for me, but it had only been annoying so far. When the Dogman came into the story, I almost had a heart attack. I'm still not okay today, but I'm writing it down to try to make sense of my feelings. I got fired from my job and dumped by my girlfriend, both in the same afternoon. I was driving back to my apartment that I now no longer knew how I would pay for, and then I got a flat tire. I can't afford to pay for other people to fix my flat tires for me, so I was out there on the side of the highway in the night, in the weather and the wind, and I was changing my tire. I was also wondering how I was going to afford to buy a new tire for my car, and I actually thought maybe I should sell the car and use the money from that. My mind was groggy. I guess it still is. I was in a kind of a reverie, focusing on jacking up the car in the rain without slipping and hurting myself. Suddenly, there was a loud beeping and a screeching sound coming from my right. I looked, and I saw a car speeding toward my left, and when I looked left, I saw what looked like a big man with weird legs running toward the car. In that first split second, I actually interpreted it in a kind of a science fiction way. I thought that the figure was running on some kind of souped-up mechanical legs, you know? Like maybe they had been disabled and given these legs by doctors, which actually made him into a superhero of sorts. I'm just saying that in that first second of seeing this, that was my first impression. But it was not an impression that would last. The car swerved to its right, and the figure swerved to its left. That meant it was now running basically right at me. I think it took 2 or 3 seconds before that creature was about to run me over. I had gotten up and pinned myself against the side of my car to try to get out of its way, and I got a really good look at what this thing was. First of all, it was not a disabled man with bionic legs. Second of all, it was not a man or a human of any kind. This was either some kind of long-snouted Bigfoot, or else possibly it was a dog-headed ape man. Its body was not like a dog, although the hind legs were, I suppose. The arms were not dog-like in the slightest. They were more like primate arms, but with sharp-looking dagger-like claws at the ends. The eyes looked wild and insane. It seemed as though it looked right through me. Or maybe that it wasn't looking at anything at all. It seemed insane, but I was possibly reading the creature's fear as it tried to run at great speeds on such a wet night. I wasn't able to think of it as being afraid at the time. I was certain it was just crazed. I watched as it ran just a few feet away past my car, then crashed into the forest and loudly continued running away. The driver of the car was standing outside his vehicle watching the thing run. He called out to me asking, "Did you see that thing?" Obviously I had seen it, so I called out to the man asking if he could give me a hand as I had a flat tire. He pretended he didn't hear me and got back in his car. I shouted louder, begging him not to leave me there alone, but he just drove away. I tell you, I never felt so bad in my life. I tried to finish changing the tire, but the rain and my tears made it hard to see. My shaking hands made it hard to work, and I slipped and banged my finger, forcing me to have to wait a while until the pain subsided before I could continue. While my finger throbbed, I thought I heard the sound of that creature coming back through the woods toward me and the highway. I looked around for a place to hide, and instead of doing the obvious thing and jumping back into my car, I panicked and I crawled underneath instead. It was just such a stupid thing to do. It's not comfortable on the wet dirt on the side of the road, hiding under your car in the rain. What was I going to do if the creature came back? I might have been better off just standing there. At least then I could make a break for it and try to run away. Although I don't think I could have outrun that thing. So every time I thought the coast was clear and I started trying to crawl out from under the car, I would hear that same rustling in the bushes again, and I would crawl back underneath. So, don't you know, when I finally got up the nerve to climb out from under and get back to fixing the wheel, I actually saw the Dogman coming back out of the woods. It wasn't running this time, just sort of walking like he was on patrol. I dove back under the car, which was 2 times in a row. I probably should have just gotten in and locked the door. I don't think the Dogman had noticed me until he heard the sound of me climbing under the car. I watched as his big, dog-like feet walked in my direction. He knew I was there, that's what I was thinking. I'm probably about to find out what happens after life, if anything. That's another thing I remember thinking at the time. I watched, my cheek on the dirt, as the huge creature approached and stopped just a few feet away. I prayed that something would distract it. I felt like the thing was about to bend down and look under the car, or sniff around or something. I was about to be caught out, and I couldn't prevent myself from crying. It was the saddest moment of my life, as everything was probably about to get severely painful. And then the Dogman ran off. I don't know where he ran to, and I don't care. I just know that I had myself a good long cry before even thinking about climbing out from under that car. That was the worst day of my life. Maybe it was over. Maybe my luck could start to change for the good now. I don't even remember changing the tire, but I am writing this from my apartment, so I got home somehow. Most of me wants to give up at this point. No job. No girlfriend. Having to find a new job in a pandemic. Things suck for me right now. And I know I should be happy that I escaped the Dogman. At least I still have a survival instinct. At least I fought back to stay alive. Logically, it means all hope is not lost. But to me, The world doesn't feel very logical right now. The flat tire, the Dogman. Instead of feeling good about surviving these things, I'm more of the feeling that the universe threw them in on top of the rest of my miseries, just for its own personal amusement. It's like the universe is taking joy out of my misery. Did I do something to deserve all this? Apparently I did. And so I take little joy in the knowledge that I saw Dogman leap a moving car. I'm a human nightmare factory, or the portability of portals. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've seen a Dogman, and I'll tell you about it. I've also seen other kinds of monsters that I don't have any name for at all. I saw monsters for years and years before the doctors put me on these medicines that made them go away. But I wasn't hallucinating them. They were all quite real. I was actually unwittingly opening portals and essentially letting them all in. Monsters, at least the kind I'm talking about, exist before they get here to our world, and yet are not real at all until they are here. It's hard to explain using words created to only describe one reality at a time. When I was young, my family lived in a small house in Matawan, New Jersey. I had a monster in my bedroom closet. Over time, I realized I had more than one monster in there at night. During the day, it seemed like a normal closet and wasn't frightening at all, but at night, it was horrifying to try to sleep near. No matter how securely I closed it, the door would always pop open in the middle of the night. My parents would scoff at me, explaining that it was an old house. It was probably just the house settling. Just because a door pops open doesn't mean you have monsters in your closet. I was bothered by them mocking me like that, but still, I couldn't explain where the monsters went during the daytime. I thought there must be a secret passageway hidden in that closet, but all my searching found nothing of the kind. Not even a trap door or anything. So I had to admit, my parents were making more sense than I was. Now, if someone could only explain that to the monsters in my closet, everything would have been okay again. Some of you may be wondering what kinds of things were in my closet. Well, I saw a shadow man come out of there on several occasions. It would come out slowly, as though looking around. Each time there would come the moment when it realized I could see it, and then it would scramble to a darkened corner like a roach avoiding the light. That always gave me shudders. If that thing meant well, it wouldn't hide in the dark from a kid. I didn't just see shadow beings, though. I saw a large-eyed man with a big head and a tiny body. He didn't really look like a space alien, though. He had a nose and a mouth and everything. He just seemed more like a monster from a nightmare. He would come over to stare at me, and I would be too terrified to move until the thing would go back into that closet. One time, I saw a cyclops come out of the closet, look around, and spot me. I hid my head under the covers and refused to look out any longer. I woke up with the covers still over my head the next morning. That was the scariest night of my childhood. So, when I was 14 or 15, my family moved to a larger and nicer house north in Essex County. I was so relieved to be moving away from that closet which had tormented me through my youth. The first week in the new house, I was walking from my bedroom at 3 a.m. to the bathroom in the hallway when I passed the hall closet. I bet you know what happened. The door opened on its own, and I froze to my spot. I had to pass that now slightly open door to get to the bathroom, and I really had to go, but I was too scared to move. I tried to think of a plan B, but there was none. I needed to get in that bathroom, past that door that I just watched open on its own. It's an old house, I told myself, but it wasn't. It was built only 20 years prior. It's the house settling, I told myself, but that didn't hold water either. Speaking of holding water, I needed to get past that closet door before there was an accident. The forces of biology pushed me forward, and I jumped into a tippy-toe sprint toward the bathroom and salvation. As I did so, I saw a shadow wearing a wide-brimmed hat rise up out of that hallway closet and just casually move itself along the walls down the hallway and down our staircase to the living room. Not only could I not move, I began to see spots in front of my eyes before I realized I had also stopped breathing. Remembering my original mission, I staggered to the toilet and relieved my physical suffering. My body was once again fine, but my mind had been thoroughly broken. Being 14 or 15 can sometimes be hard all by itself. You can feel isolated and alone just as a matter of course. But it all hit down much harder on me once we moved into that second place. I had escaped the one closet only to now have to deal with this new one. And I knew I would have to keep it to myself, since my parents would only say hurtful things if they knew what I had just experienced. I adapted to going to the bathroom before bed from then on, hoping to last until the sun came up before I would need to use it again. I really feared having to walk past the Hat Man closet to get to the men's room. I began calling the closet just that, never explaining why. In fact, my mother did store some of her dad's old fedora hats from the 20th century up on the top shelf in there. Maybe she thought that was the reason I called it that. So anyway, I lived my quiet life of private desperation for a year or two until I was at a friend's house for Halloween, and they popped in a VHS cassette of the movie Poltergeist. I think I had seen it before, but I don't think I had really watched it before. That was the time when the concept of a portal between realities really impressed itself on me. Since that day, I've felt certain that was what was happening in the case of my childhood bedroom closet, as well as the hallway closet in the new home. There were portals there, but portals that were somehow directly related to me personally. Nobody else had seen what was in there. It was somehow not just a thing that happened. It was a thing that happened when I paid attention to it. It wasn't happening to me exactly. It was happening with me. I don't fully understand it, even though I've spent years since then trying to figure it out. My Dogman sighting happened after my wife and I bought our home, in which we still live in. This was after years of prescription medication when I never thought I'd see a monster ever again. I don't want to say where we live for obvious reasons, but when we moved in, we were both extremely happy. Things went smoothly for the first 9 or 10 months. It had reached the point where I had forgotten that things even could go wrong. I had forgotten that I had ever been afraid of anything. But it was just a good luck streak. And all good luck streaks eventually end. Mine ended when I saw the Dogman. You have to understand, I spent decades training myself to accept my fears, but make decisions based in confidence and positivity. I had turned my life around, married a woman too good for me, gotten a job better than I had ever imagined, and settled into a cushy middle-class existence. Seeing the Dogman changed all that. Just seeing him one time was all it took to return me to the state of fear I had subsisted through for my entire childhood. No, I didn't see Dogman coming out of a closet. I saw him in the woods behind our home. He was carrying something in his front paws, the way a bear will pick up smaller prey when eating. It was not a bear, though. It was a wolf-like thing, grayish in color, with the largest teeth I'd ever seen in an animal's mouth. It was sticky with dark red liquid that I imagined had once been the smaller animal's lifeblood. I felt nauseous, seeing the thing sitting there on its haunches, holding its dinner in its paws. But then, it turned its immense dinosaur dog head, and it saw me. Then, it did something I had not expected it to do. It rose off its haunches, and it stood up, and up, and up. It must have raised that enormous prehistoric dog head 7 or 8 feet up in the air, when I turned and ran inside and called the cops to tell them I had a prowler on the property. They found nothing, but suggested to me that I install motion-activated lights and cameras, which we did shortly thereafter. I haven't seen that monster again since then, at least not so far. I never told my wife what actually happened. She still thinks it was a prowler. I tell you, each time I see the light coming on from outside one of our windows at night, I see that thing rising up from its squatting position to stand so impossibly tall, and it keeps me from ever feeling secure in my own home. But I don't think the Dogman was just a natural animal visiting our property. I think that thing came here from that other world, the same world where the Hat Man comes from and the Cyclops and the big-headed people. I think the Dogman appeared to scare me because I somehow sent the message to my subconscious that I wanted to live in fear again. I'm trying to send a different message, but I genuinely fear that Dogman. It was the most horrible thing I ever saw. Nothing could have been more frightening than that bloody demonic dog thing. I'm of the theory, based on my personal experiences, that portals are created in collaboration with ourselves. We don't always realize we're helping because it often doesn't involve much conscious effort. What has been called the unconscious or the subconscious is what's truly responsible, but those terms don't really describe what we're discussing very well. It would be somewhat more accurate to call it a superconsciousness. It has awareness of things that the part of our consciousness locked in our personalities and egos can't even fathom. Not only that, but we have to consider the portability of portals. I thought there was a portal in my closet. Then my family moved, and there was a new portal in the new home. It would appear wherever I would be most frightened by it, because of my collaboration in my own haunting. When I was a kid, I was a chronic worrier. I would worry about every little detail. I would wake up in the night with cold sweats, remembering that I forgot to do something for homework. I would worry that I would forget to do something the next day. But all my worrying only made me a nervous wreck. It also seemed to make the likelihood of my fears coming true more likely, not less. It took me years, decades, to learn that I was making my own life harder. As I would go to sleep each night worrying, envisioning all the things that could go wrong. My unconscious or superconscious mind, the one with no personality, but much greater awareness of the true nature of reality, would be soaking all this up. Not just watching it like on TV, but feeling all the worry and stress I was feeling. The superconsciousness wants to give us what we deeply want the most. But when we go to sleep thinking about doom, it misunderstands what we're saying. It thinks that we're asking for a nightmare life with everything going wrong. These days, I consciously only allow myself to think happy thoughts as I'm going to sleep. It doesn't always work, but life is often less horrible than it used to be. However, this is a story about when my life was horrible every day and I didn't know any of these profound teachings yet. Why do people see Dogman so much more often than the other monsters I've described? I think it's because of the werewolf brand. It's something that a lot of people know about and fear. There are so many Hollywood movies about werewolves because they usually make their investments back. People just naturally are afraid of the very idea of upright walking wolves or canines. We all have a deep inbred fear of half-man, half-beast entities. I don't know if these things have ever existed in the same sense we exist, or bears or mountain lions do. I do know that they exist now because we're afraid of them. It's possibly an ancient tribal memory of ours, but it might just be an archetypal nightmare form that's universally horrifying. It doesn't really matter if the chicken came first or the egg in this instance, because the end result is that the Dogman or werewolf is now a very real archetype. If you're a Jungian, then you accept that any archetype is capable of being manifested in various forms, but most especially in dreams. And dreams, in my theory, can open portals. Dreams can open doorways that let the forces from that side enter our waking world, which is really not so awake as we think. When nightmare forces enter our world, they take the shape of whatever would frighten us most in that moment. To a lot of people, that's werewolves, or the Dogman. Or maybe it only seems obvious to me because I'm a human nightmare factory. So, what do you think? Was that guy on the level? We got one more story about the Dogman, but first, please join me in thanking today's executive producer, Skitsy's mom. She's fantastic. She da bomb. She's our EP, Skitsy's mom. Let's all thank her for helping to make this episode possible. If you'd like to help us somehow keep the channel alive, all you have to do is join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or become a channel member by clicking the join link below. In return, you'll get to see our secret uncensored Sunday stories with tales far too wild to ever tell on this channel. Speaking of wild, here's a story from a couple who claims they saw something very wild, but they want you to help them figure out what exactly it was they saw. This is why they're asking the musical question: was what we saw a Dogman? My wife insists that we saw the Dogman, but I think the thing was probably something more like a man-sized upright possum. I'll explain our sighting in some detail, then explain why we each feel the way we do. We were driving overnight to get home from my wife's mother's house, where we had just delivered certain family items. It's a long story. We were just past Callahan, driving west on I-64 right along the border between Virginia and West Virginia. It was dark out, and there are no lights on that highway over there. Coming up ahead of us, on our right, was something walking out of the woods, very light in color. At least it looked light-colored in my headlights. It was covered in fur that was either a grayish color or else very reflective and shiny so that it looked gray when lit up in the darkness. My wife agrees with all of that so far. Oh, and it was walking on a stone path leading out of the woods, like it was walking up its own front path to go get the mail or something. We agree on that part, too. A lot of the rest of this splits into two different descriptions, though. I'll try my best to explain both sides clearly. Before I begin, I should mention that the entire sighting lasted maybe 6 or 7 seconds. My wife was not driving, and she may have noticed it a second before me, but not more than that. According to her, this was an upright, walking canine of some sort. It seemed to be the size of a large man, so let's say between 6 and 7 feet tall. It had a long snout and ears that stood up on top of its head. The eyes reflected back our headlights very brightly. The creature had arms that it held out in front of it as it walked. My wife says the arms ended in hand-like claws like werewolves in the movies. I agree that the paws seemed to have fingers and opposable thumbs, but they were pink, and I've never heard of a dogman or werewolf with pink hands. The legs were bent like an animal's hind legs and did not appear human in any way. It had a long, straight tail that we both agree was hairless. My wife thinks that this might have been because of the dogman having mange or some similar type affliction. I, of course, have a different theory. The creature saw us, and rather than running back to the safety of the woods, it seemed to charge faster down that stone pathway as though it were hoping to catch up to us on the road. Needless to say, I stomped down on the gas pedal when I saw that. My wife screaming bloody murder, we drove past the monster at a speed threatening to break the sound barrier. She stared behind us for most of the rest of the way home. We both felt paranoid that it was following us, so I didn't mind if she watched behind as we drove. Now, as I said, my interpretation of what happened is quite different from the way my wife sees it. I remember even that night thinking that it didn't seem like it was really a dogman to me. I didn't even think it was a canine in any way, but I couldn't quite figure out what I did think it was. Well, anyway, last week my wife got the new Archie McPhee catalog in the mail, and the picture on the cover grabbed my attention. That was what I saw. They had this toy I had never seen before. It looked like a gray rat with hands that had thumbs on them. It looked just like what we saw. I showed it to my wife and told her that what we saw was this giant bipedal rat, not a dog. She laughed at me because that Archie McPhee toy is not a rat at all. It's supposed to be a possum. Looks more like a rat than a possum to me, but either way, that is what I saw a bipedal pink-handed 6 or 7 foot tall version of along I-64 that night. I didn't know a possum would charge at a car like that. I was not aware that they could be hostile critters. If this was a possum, could it have been a one-off, like some of those wild giant-sized pigs that show up every so often? Or could there be others out there as large as this one was? Also, what's the deal with the upright walking? My wife insists that the creature we saw had pointed ears on top of its head, so it wasn't a bear. Now, I don't agree entirely. I mean, I know it wasn't a bear, but the ears were not pointed. Granted, they were not as circular as bear ears, but they were not as pointed as wolf ears either. They just looked like the ears on the Archie McPhee possum toy. And that's why I'm still not sure. Was what we saw a dogman? I can feel when Dogman is near. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I grew up a city boy in Boston, but just before the pandemic hit, I bought myself a home in the outskirts of the suburbs of Pittsburgh. It wasn't a random decision. My girlfriend's job had been relocated to that area. It was my hope and my goal to eventually convince her to marry me, so the house is big enough that we could raise a kid or two there. It's far too large for me to live in alone, but I got it cheap, and it was very quiet, surrounded by forests and hills. No immediate neighbors, although it was only a 10-minute walk to the next house over in case of an emergency. It would be a good place to raise kids, that's what I thought when I got it. After moving in, I began to have strange experiences that are hard to describe. It was almost like hearing a sound, in that it felt like a vibration, but it was also a lot like experiencing an extreme emotion. I have never had that kind of experience before moving to this house. I thought at first I was experiencing a health issue, but soon I became convinced it was something in the vicinity causing me to have these uncomfortable episodes. It wasn't long before I found myself walking toward the woods behind my property one afternoon. I felt as though I were homing in on the signal that was causing me to feel weird and to sort of see things. I say sort of because I thought I was seeing things out of the corner of my eye. I would look directly there and no longer see anything out of place, though. It might have been ultrasound or infrasound or whichever one it is that vibrates your eyeballs and is said to be able to cause hallucinations. I walked under the tree cover, which immediately felt a whole lot cooler than the late afternoon daylight. It was dark as night under there, and the crickets were loud. Everything smelled damp and moldy. I suddenly sensed great curiosity, but it wasn't my own. I sensed that someone else was curious. What were they curious about? The largest dog I had ever seen walked casually out from behind some foliage, and somehow I could see him seeing me. I saw that he was curious about me with my eyes, but it wasn't something I gleaned from his facial expression and behavior. I was actually experiencing his experience in real time. I stared into his eyes, but I saw what he was seeing by staring at me. Then I remember feeling great alarm. I had alarmed him. How? I was looking him directly in the eye, that's how. He was convinced I was challenging him, that I wanted to end his life. He was literally afraid for his life because of me. I tried to let him feel that I was no threat, but our weird connection only seemed to be one way. The huge, grayish-brown dog tilted back and stood up on its hind legs, its head crashing up into the lower tree cover overhead. I can't even estimate how big it looked to me. It's possible I was hallucinating all of this, but it sure didn't look, smell, or feel like a fantasy. I ran back toward my house and I could feel the panicked giant behind me not knowing what to do. He did not see me as prey. He saw me as a threat to him. I could feel that he was torn between letting me go and making a run for it, or trying to catch me and put an end to the threat I represented once and for all. It was when he understood that I was heading back toward the house that he made his decision. He thought I was going back to the house to either get others to come after him or to get a weapon. I had to be stopped, in his opinion. His heart racing as fast as mine, the panicked and confused beast began pushing trees aside and making his way out of the woods after me. This was just a few months ago, but it feels like I'm describing another life. In those days, I would lounge around the house in my pajamas and bathrobe all day long. That was what I had on that afternoon when I was wandering out back. Slippers on my feet. I was not prepared to run away from a monster, but I did what I could. I lost the slippers on the grass almost immediately. I remember that part clearly. Much of the rest, though, is a blur. The creature caught up to me outside my back door and swiped with his huge claws. Only one time, but he tore half my bathrobe off my back as though it were a Hollywood-made breakaway outfit. I did make it inside, and I watched the eyes of the enraged thing, furious that it couldn't break down that heavy old door. Well, it became hard to be me anymore after that. I mean, I couldn't behave the way I always had. I wanted to be fully dressed as much of the time as possible. I wanted boots on, not slippers. I learned self-defense, but I still never felt safe. I couldn't tell anyone what was going on, because they would have thought I was a paranoid schizophrenic. Hell, that's what I would have thought if anyone told this story to me. But it wasn't like I was seeing demons over my shoulder. It's just that somehow my nervous system is acting like a receiver, tuning in the nervous system of this mythological creature. See what I mean? It sounds crazy, even to me, and I'm living it. It's hard to want to have anyone over here, so I'm trying to sell the place. I've had zero interest so far, and in fact, the realtor told me it went unoccupied for 5 years before I moved in. My work has been suffering. I can't sleep at night, and my concentration is shattered. Even though I moved out here to be closer to my girlfriend, I'm not even sure she is my girlfriend anymore. I haven't actually seen her in person for over a week, and it didn't go well the last time we tried to have a date. I'm just not myself any longer. It hurts to not be able to share what I'm going through with anyone in my life, so I'm writing this down for you just to get it off my chest. I can tell when the Dogman is around. I can feel that he's still threatened by me. I can tell he wants me out of here, and I want to go. I wish I could let him know that I'm trying to leave. I wish I could ask him to be patient. I'm a prisoner in my own home, afraid to walk around outside. The place has become overgrown already. It's messed up, same as I am. My world is falling apart because I can't really deal with all these various stresses collected together at one time. Everything I knew turned into a horror show on the day I realized that I can feel when Dogman is near. Our EP is Out of the Box, executive produced by Timothy Cox. Please welcome our brand new executive producer, Timothy Cox. He joined at the $3 level so he gets to see all our uncensored Dogman stories that we put out on Sunday nights. Plus, he has access to our over 8 hours of archived uncensored stories. You can become a channel member too by clicking that join link or joining our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Dr. Death will be on at the end of the show to tell you more about that. But first, here's the Dogman story that was featured in our thumbnail today, and we call this one, I Saw Dogman Stealing a Jack-o'-lantern. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got an odd one for you. This happened way back in the 1970s when it became a fashion in my neighborhood in New Jersey to decorate one's house elaborately for Halloween. We had been into the big Christmas decorations already for years, but in that time we also added Halloween decorations to our local culture. It was almost a competition, although it stayed a friendly one, at least on our block. My parents weren't interested in winning. They would always do enough to fit in, but not really enough to stand out. Our neighbor diagonally across from us, though, let's call them the Petersons, they always put on the biggest show. They were the nicest family in the world, and the rest of us on the block were always sort of protective of them. They would create beautiful things that they would make themselves, and sometimes we would catch people trying to steal their skeletons and their life-size Grim Reaper, which they built out of abandoned wood scraps. One year, though, my father tried to stop a thief that he really wished he had just ignored. That's because that one year, we saw a werewolf or a Dogman stealing the Petersons' biggest jack-o'-lantern, candle inside and all. There is no preamble to this story. We were sitting out on our front porch after dinner, which was a thing we did in the summer mostly, but this was a warm autumn evening and the house was hot inside from Mom using the oven most of the day. We heard the sound of a dog walking on pavement. You know, that sound of their nails clicking on the asphalt. I looked over, but I didn't see a dog. Well, not exactly. I mean, the head on this thing looked like a dog, that's for sure. It was some kind of a wolf man, but with a real wolf head. There was nothing human about the head at all. I immediately saw it as a monster. I did not perceive it as a man in a Halloween costume. It was a real werewolf, and under its arm was one of the Petersons' nicest and largest jack-o'-lanterns. My father saw things differently than I did. He saw a teenage punk stealing his nice neighbor's property, and he leaped into action. Before I could say a word to him, he was on his feet, marching toward that werewolf or person in a costume. He seemed angry and annoyed, and he looked like he was about to tell that guy off. I wanted to run after him to stop him, but there was no way I was going to get any closer to that werewolf or dogman than I absolutely needed to be. I wasn't sure what to do, but I did manage to shout out, "Dad, don't!" to him, which caused my mother to give me an annoyed look. "Don't tell your father what to do," she scolded me. "He's your father. You're not his." Feeling helpless, I watched as my old man took step after step towards something terrible. I remember their confrontation as though it happened in slow motion. Dad was shouting at the guy and pointing to the lit-up pumpkin he was carrying under his arm. The big guy interrupted Dad by baring his very real-looking, very large-looking fangs, a full row, top and bottom, of dangerous fangs. Dad told me later he could hear him growling, but we couldn't hear that back at the house. We did hear the thing barking loudly and angrily. He was so tall, which you couldn't really tell until Dad was right in front of him. He bent down to bark right in my father's face, and Dad began backstepping. My mother gripped my arm and told me to do something. I told her I was trying to do something, but she ordered me to shut up. She began arguing like an idiot, so I removed her hand forcibly from my arm, and I walked off toward my father. I didn't think the monster would try to attack both of us, so I made it clear I had my dad's back. I was trying not to openly challenge the creature. I was not going to charge him, but I did want to stand with my dad and back off with him. So that's what we both did. The creature ceased advancing on Dad once I was there, and we were able to walk backward back to our property, never taking our eyes off the 7-foot or taller hairy dogman. We got a plenty good look at the thing. It did exhibit eye shine as its eyes were fully dilated. It seemed quite excited and on edge, and I think we were lucky as hell that it finally decided to run off down our neighbor's driveway across the street and head towards the woods back over there. I also think the community is lucky that the dogman didn't burn down that forest by accident with his candle-lit jack-o'-lantern under his arm, but I guess that's another story. So it was gray, meaning the fur on it was gray. It had pointed ears on top of its head, so it was not a Bigfoot, and it had bent legs like the back legs of a dog, so it was not a man in a dog costume. We had no idea what it was, so we called it a werewolf. I mean, maybe it was a werewolf. It certainly looked like it could be. It was 20 years later, in the 1990s, when I read an article in some magazine that talked about the Beast of Bray Road. That sounded an awful lot like what we saw and what had glared down my dad. It was like a bear, and yet it wasn't. It was like a dog, and a man too, but it wasn't those either. It was something else, something all its own. So I guess we maybe saw a New Jersey dogman? Do people see these things in New Jersey? Or else, since it was a few days before Halloween, maybe it really was a werewolf. Maybe it was something that came from the other side. People say the veil between the worlds is thinner at Halloween, so maybe this came from one of those other worlds. And maybe it went right back. I never have seen anything like it again, and I've never personally heard another reported sighting in New Jersey. At least, not in our part of the state. I'm not sure what else it could have been, so I feel somewhat confident in stating that I saw a dogman stealing a jack-o'-lantern. Dogman. On my friend's family's grounds. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid, I had a rich friend whose family lived in a mansion in the middle of a lot of land. It was largely overgrown and forested land, and it was fun to explore when we would play together. The two of us became best friends for a couple of years, and I visited his house so often that my mother would just drop me off at a spot that was convenient for her outside the family estate. I'd get off at the side of the road and cut through the forest to take a shortcut to the house. For her to drive me down the quarter-mile-long driveway to the front door would take an extra 5 or 10 minutes out of her day, and I enjoyed cutting through the woods better, so that was the way we would do it almost all the time. One late afternoon, my mom dropped me off with my backpack for a sleepover, and I headed into the woods. Almost immediately, I saw something that I never expected to see in real life with my own 2 eyes. I saw what seemed at first to be a dog walking on its hind legs. It made me laugh to see it, so I took a few steps toward it out of curiosity. I was not afraid of dogs, even large ones, so I wanted to meet this guy. Once I got somewhat closer, though, I saw that the body was more filled out than I expected. It appeared to have a torso, much more like a big muscular man than like any dog I had ever seen. Alarm bells went off in my head, and in the next second, that dog thing saw me. Tearing through the underbrush in record time, I made it back to the road and began screaming after my mother as she drove away. I waved my arms over my head, hoping she would see me, and she did. Slowing the car down so I could catch up, she rolled down her window and began making fun of me, asking if I forgot my underwear. She didn't understand. I was running for my life. I caught up with the car and I tried to open the door, which she had not unlocked for me. That car had this thing so the driver could lock or unlock all the doors, and my mother wasn't getting it. She thought I wanted to have a conversation, but I just wanted to get in that car and get out of that neighborhood before I ended up dog food dinner. "Open it up," I shouted. "Open, open, open." My mother rolled her eyes, thinking I was being dramatic, but she did unlock the door. I threw myself in, put my backpack on my legs in front of me, and shouted, "Go!" "Go where, dear?" asked my mother, still being condescending, because she thought I was behaving childishly. "We need to go," I told her emphatically, getting no response. "Oh, we do, eh?" she asked. "Are we running from something, dear?" "Yes," I shouted at her. "We're running from that." And then I pointed at the beast emerging from the woods. It was as though it just kept coming out. There was more and more and more of it. This thing looked even larger once it was on the road than it had looked in the woods. My mother screamed at the top of her lungs and hit the gas. "You idiot," she shouted at me. "Why didn't you tell me what was happening?" Of course I had, but what are you going to do? I was just happy she was driving away. Except I looked out the back, and that dog thing was trotting after us on its hind legs. It was running in the way a man would run, but it wasn't a man because it was too tall. It was too thin in the middle, and its legs were not human at all. Mom kept screaming, and I learned 3 new curse words that day. We sped out of there, but the beast kept following us along the old country road. We finally came up to the one intersection over in that area, and there was a pickup truck stopped at the red light. "Get out of the way," shouted my mother as she beeped wildly at the truck, but he wasn't paying attention. She drove up on the side of the road, sped past him, and we nearly got sideswiped at full speed by a car that actually had the right of way. We didn't care, though, because we got away from that Dogman. I never saw it run past that intersection. Maybe it went back into the woods over there, I'm not sure. And I don't care either. I'm just glad we got away. My rich friend's mom actually came to pick me up to bring me over for the sleepover because my mother refused to ever drive in that neighborhood ever again. I wouldn't ride my bike over there anymore either. My dad was brave enough to drive me over sometimes, but I made him drive me right to the front door of the place, all the way at the end of their quarter-mile-long driveway. One time, I even took a cab there. I had the fear of dog put into me that late afternoon when I saw the Dogman on my friend's family's grounds. I just want to note that this next story was sent in to us by a woman. I didn't have time to send it to Madeline Starr to read, so I'm going to read it myself. I know that might be a bit jarring or confusing, so I thought I should warn you in advance. And the title of this particular tale is I Left My Werewolf Boyfriend for a Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I know you won't believe me, and I know you'll put a disclaimer before my story, stating that you don't believe it or whatever, so that YouTube doesn't get you for spreading fake news. I could send this to a channel that would read it word for word, but I'm sending it to you, so please return the favor by staying true to my original email. You can tell your audience you think this is fake all you want, but it's my life and I'm living it, so it sure seems real to me. I was once engaged to marry a man that I knew was a werewolf. I had seen him transform. I'd seen him in his beast form. I was once even threatened by him while he was the monster, but he did not hurt me. He's a kind man and a gentle man. For almost a year, I traveled the countryside with him, living out of tents while he hunted at night for our next day's food. I learned to gut fish and prepare wild game for meals. He taught me a lot of things I never thought I would want to learn. I loved him a great deal, and I guess I still do. It's just that when I saw the Dogman, my werewolf boyfriend began to seem far too civilized for my tastes. I must be giving the wrong impression of myself. I'm not, well, I didn't used to be a vagabond or hobo wandering around the forests of the country. I was born into a well-off family back east. They sent me to a good school in the Midwest, and that was where I met my werewolf boyfriend. That was where I began to change into the person that I am today. Back then, I used to wear pink every day. I used to be a fashionista. I used to teach my classmates how to do their makeup. I was a total girly girl, and that version of me would probably not even recognize the version of me that's writing you this email. In fact, I ran into an old friend of mine at a diner last year before the virus pandemic started, and I had to talk to her for a full minute before she realized that we used to be dorm mates at college. After that, she couldn't close her jaw for a while. She was that surprised to see the changes in me. From the look in her eyes, I felt like she was considering running away from me in fear, but the longer we talked about old times and brought each other up to date about our current situation, the more she calmed down and seemed to accept me for who I'd become. At one point, she even mentioned that I looked happier than I used to look, and she asked me who the guy was that made me happier. I laughed and admitted that there was a guy, but wouldn't tell her more. She assumed he was a bank robber or something, and that I was living a life of adventure on the run from the law. The more I denied it, the more she believed her own theory. I wouldn't tell her anything about werewolves or dogmen, though. I would prefer she think I was hitched up to a bank robber. That's easier to believe than the truth. I imagined the faces of the others that she would tell about me. I figured they would all pity me, but I pitied them. They'll never know what it's like to be truly free and to live by your instincts. I suppose I wasn't really actually as free as my boyfriend, because I still did go back to my P.O. box every couple of months to collect the checks my parents still sent me. They didn't believe in direct deposit. They're even weirder than I am, so I still collect their paper checks and I still deposit them in my checking account, and I still carry a debit card so that I can buy things. I guess I was living about 80% off the grid, but every few weeks I did love to get some scrambled eggs and toast at the diner instead of eating squirrel or rabbit for breakfast as usual. Some of you want me to stop talking about myself and explain how I winded up dating a werewolf. I know you want to hear about him, not about me. I'm taking my time leading up to that because I want to make certain I don't give out any information that will mess his situation up. I would not want to accidentally out him, so I'm trying to be careful about what details I leave in or take out. Let's call this boy Reggie, which was not his real name. He did well in classes, but you could tell his interest was elsewhere. He always seemed to be staring out the window when the professor would call on him, yet he would always respond in such a way that it was clear he had been listening to the lecture intensely. He seemed so badass and into his own world that I desperately wanted to know him better. I tried smiling at him. I tried starting conversations. He was never exactly rude in response, but he wasn't all that interested either. I basically had to stalk the guy to get him to really notice me. Even then, he would never ask me out. So I asked him, and he said no. Of course, once he turned me down, I knew I was in love and that it was the real deal. I spied on him and made friends with his friends. I turned up wherever people told me he might be, and I managed to slowly ingratiate myself with him until I was a part of his life. Eventually, when he would see me at parties, he would come over to say hi. I was making inroads. He was beginning to accept the inevitable, that he should be my boyfriend. The first time Reggie ever actually asked me out, he told me I should go camping with him. I know that's not the right way to ask someone out, and that's not really a first date kind of thing to do, but let's face it, this is what I wanted all along. I would have him paying attention to me and me alone for 2 days in a row. Well, that was the greatest weekend of my life, and it was definitely worth the work and wait. We quickly made plans to go camping again as soon as we could, which I think was about 2 weeks after the first time. Our second outing was not the success the first one had been. It was just as magical as the first weekend. But this time, the enchantment was constructed from a darker magic. I never know how to tell this part of the story. It's hard for me to explain. We were toasting marshmallows by the fire, and he was telling me a story about a guy that used to go to our school in the 1930s, who later got involved in these experiments to create real-life Captain Americas. He claimed it was true, but I don't know. I'm not sure what a real-life Captain America would even be exactly, but it doesn't matter anyway because the experiments supposedly failed. In desperation to save his funding, this guy took his own formula and changed himself into this sort of Jekyll and Hyde monster. Which one was the monster, Jekyll or Hyde? Well, he turned into that one. So, Reggie wasn't at a point in the story where the main character changes, but suddenly, Reggie started acting like he was having a seizure and doing the whole Dr. Jekyll bit. I thought he was acting out the transformation, so at first I laughed at him. The way his eyes were bugging out and he was palpitating all over. I thought he should definitely go into acting in horror movies. But when his eyes changed to stop looking human, and his nose and mouth grew out into a dog-like snout, I understood. I was not watching an acting performance. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it wasn't being faked by him. I got on my phone and I called 911 because I thought he was having a stroke or something. His arms were flailing wildly around as he was obviously in great pain, and by accident, he knocked the phone out of my hand. By the time I retrieved it, I had lost the connection. Behind me, I heard ripping sounds and a kind of screaming that was no longer entirely Reggie. I looked back and saw that he had changed into a huge, beautiful beast. He had become the forest itself, and he ran off into it. My first impulse was to run after him. My second impulse was to hide in the tent and hope he didn't come back and maul me to death. I felt both love for him and absolute abject fear of him at the same time. I didn't know if he loved me back or saw me as food, and there was something about that which made me love him more deeply. I'm not going to act like that was a happy night for me because it was not. I didn't know if he would come back at all, and if he did, I didn't know what was going to happen. It took a long time before I cried myself to sleep. In the morning, I heard snoring outside the tent. Unzipping and looking out, I found Reggie curled up asleep on the grass. A rabbit he had hunted, left for me as a present outside the tent flap. I had myself a pet werewolf. We both forgot about school. We just spent our lives in nature, doing whatever felt natural. It was the deepest sense of love and connection I had felt up to that point. We could go half a day without saying a word, but we communicated with each other anyway, through every single movement and facial expression. It was a time like the Garden of Eden, a period with no fear and all excited happiness. I wished it would never end. I can't control what makes me happy. I can only be honest about what I'm experiencing. Still, once you've gone with a werewolf, regular guys are just regular. I've read people talking about relationships like this, but most of the time they don't ring true to me. Like when the werewolf takes his mate on an adventure with him, unless she's a werewolf too, I don't see how that could happen. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I personally find it far-fetched. I admit, I have fantasized about it though. I have come close to asking Reggie to take me with him, but I never actually did. It was hard enough to get him to talk about the experience at all. I remember asking him what it was like to run under the moon chasing down prey, what it was like to howl at the moon. "It's not at the moon," he interrupted to say. When I asked him to go on, he shook me off, saying that the conversation had gotten too cringy for him. I kind of think putting it into words seemed lame to him, or that it didn't have anything to do with his human ego, so he was annoyed and cringed at my line of questioning. I'm not sure about that though, and that was part of my attraction to him. He was a mystery to me. I was never going to completely understand him. The next time I made it into town to collect checks for my P.O. box, there was a note included with them informing me that my mother had been trying to reach me. Checking my phone, I discovered that this was indeed the case. I had kept it turned off most of the time, since I could only recharge it when back in town, and besides, I didn't have anything to say to anyone anymore. But I called my mom back, and by the end of the overlong conversation, I had accepted a trailer home from her as a present. She wanted me to have a place to stay where she could find me, even if it was a trailer park, which I know she and Dad looked down on. Reggie and I checked the mobile home out, but at first we didn't move in. I guess it might have been 3 or 4 months later when Reg said we should settle down and think about marriage. He moved into the trailer, and so I did too. It was everything I had hoped might happen, and yet, it didn't feel the way I thought it would. There was something about watching my fierce, feral werewolf putting up little battery-powered lights over the sink that made me less interested in him. It was fun to call him my pet werewolf when we were living off his hunting skills. Actually having a domesticated puppy doing anything I asked around the house was far less of a turn-on. Still, he was being so good, I tried to keep acting like it was as exciting as it had once been. The magic was seeping out of our relationship a bit more each time he made me breakfast in bed. Each time he swept up around the place. I didn't chase down this wild beast only to domesticate him and make him into some kind of poodle. But like I said, he wasn't doing anything wrong, so I kept encouraging him. There was no way I could explain to him that I'd rather not be pampered. I wanted to be taken. When I consented only, of course, but still, I didn't want him being so civilized. What would you have done in my situation? A friend of mine from school was getting married, and her mom was besties with my mom, so I was basically ordered to come back for the wedding week sans boyfriend. It was ridiculous. Fittings, rehearsals. I felt like we were staging a Broadway play. I was completely out of my element and wishing I was back in the woods. Tried calling Reggie, but he's not much of a chatter. So, although everyone was being very nice to me, I felt quite alone in the crowd there. My mom had moved into this nice house a few years earlier that I had only slept in maybe a dozen times. It wasn't where I grew up, so it wasn't like going home. It was almost more like staying at a hotel. My days were planned out by my mother, who had bought me a wardrobe just for that week. I did as I was asked, my mind on getting out of there and back home, although my domesticated puppy in the trailer was not as exciting as when I had been camping out with a werewolf. As the week wore on, and the excellent food and drink started to make me feel pampered and spoiled, the idea of going back to living in a trailer seemed somehow less desirable. I was feeling a lot of conflicting emotions, wondering why I had to decide between these two sides of me. And so, one night, in my mother's house, I was sleeping in the third different bedroom I had tried to sleep in but not having any better luck. I got out of bed and went to sit by the window, looking out at the woods past the backyard. In my peripheral vision, I kept thinking I was seeing a figure under the tree cover. I'll be frank, I thought I was seeing Reggie. But not Reggie, I mean werewolf Reggie. The idea of that was fascinating to me. It would have been very uncool of him to stalk me here to my mom's house. But then again, I like guys who do uncool things. I went downstairs and I walked out into the backyard, staring into the darkness beyond, hoping to get a clearer view and figure out if I was imagining things or not. I walked toward the woods, not seeing anything but shadows under the tree cover. It was a pretty dark night with no moon, and the only ambient light I had was coming from behind me inside the house. I listened and heard nothing. So I took another few steps when I distinctly heard what I thought was a tiger growling. I had seen a tiger at the circus up close when I was young, and that was the same kind of growl that it made. I thought it must be a mountain lion or something of that nature, so I turned and hurried back toward the house. That was the wrong thing to do, because it made me appear as prey in the eyes of whatever was making that growling noise. I heard it burst from the trees, and I knew it was coming after me. I had a 70 or 80 foot head start, but I barely slammed the door behind me when the creature ran into it hard, shaking the entire house. I double locked the door as I looked outside through the small window and saw not a tiger, not a mountain lion, not any kind of cat, big or small. I saw a dog-headed man, just like a werewolf, just like my Reggie, but nothing like him at all. This was a creature that was furry in a different way than Reggie would get. It looked more like a wolf mixed with a fox in terms of its face, but it was gray, while Reggie was brown. They were really very different from each other. Obviously, I was surprised on a number of different levels, and I was also afraid for my life. The Dogman backed off and was about to charge the door for a second time when he looked up at me, watching him through the small glass window. When our eyes met, his expression changed. I've heard you should never look a predator in the eye because he will take it as a challenge. That's not what happened. When our eyes met, we had a namaste moment. We sort of said hello with our eyes. The anger removed from him, the Dogman just sort of stared for a while, then dropped to all fours and trotted back to the woods, panting like any other giant wolf-headed man-beast. I ran and woke up my mother even though it was after midnight, and I told her what I saw. I had obviously never told her about Reggie's lycanthropy, but I had no reason not to tell her about this episode which happened on her property. Mom was like, "You saw him too?" She hadn't seen the Dogman herself, but she told me that her chauffeur and handyman was always talking about the Dogman that roams around that neighborhood. He used to work for the family that lived there before, and he says the Dogman was there before he ever visited the area. It's always been there. Like nature itself, this Dogman has always been there. He is the ultimate mystery. He could never be domesticated. He would never put up little battery-powered lights over my sink for me. He would never become civilized. But I wonder what it would be like to try to civilize him. Right after the wedding, the quarantine was about to start. I had to make a decision to head back to Reggie in the trailer park or stay with my mom for the duration. I don't know why, but I stayed with my mom. I have not seen that Dogman again, but I know I will. I have sensed him there on some nights. I go for walks in the forest and somehow I know he's there, and that he's as confused by me as I am by him. I'm sure I'll get back with Reg at some point. At least probably. Maybe after the weather gets too cold to camp out in the woods behind my mom's place anymore. Or else maybe next year. Or, I guess I could just be honest and admit that I find the Dogman more interesting than I find werewolves. I don't know how to move away from the sheer mystery of the thing. I suppose you could say I left my werewolf boyfriend for a Dogman. Hey ho, yo yo, don't you know, no. This show was produced by 12 Hats Radio. Please join me in thanking 12 Hats Radio for making this episode possible. Well, let's all hop in the Bigfoot balloon and fly north to cool, snowy Alaska. I hear tell we've got 2 all-new Dogman stories that both take place in that very remote and wild state. But just as exciting as those 2 new stories coming later is our executive producer coming right now, namely Avril Barkley. We'd like to thank Miss Avril Barkley. She makes us feel all light and sparkly. As sure as parents still have children, we appreciate Avril then. We literally couldn't do this show without nice people such as the eternally immortal Ms. Avril Barkley. If you would like to become as admired and indispensable as she is, all you have to do is click the join link under this video or join our paid subscribers at peterbernard.com. In either case, you'll get a new secret uncensored story each Sunday night, one too wild to tell on this channel, plus access to our now over 10-hour archive of uncensored Dogman stories. Speaking of Dogman, many of them reported around the planet really seem more like wolf men, or upright walking wolves more so than they seem like dogs, in the sense we tend to usually think of dogs in modern times. Some of the largest wolves we know of live and grow in Alaska, so should we be surprised to hear of Dogman sightings happening up there? Let's head up north in this episode. Put on your winter boots and a heavy overcoat. You're gonna need to cover your head better than that too, mister. Or missy. We've got to go up through Canada and then head west until we reach the wildest part of the United States, the unforgiving and mysterious wilderness of Alaska, home of so many mysterious and creepy disappearances of ordinary people that there are probably more theories as to what's actually going on up there than there are residents of the entire state. Let's take this first story for example. It's alleged to have taken place in Petersville. Wikipedia says that in 2010, Petersville had a total of 4 people living in it. That was down from 20 people back in the year 2000. I think if I were heading through an area with a population of 4, I would almost expect to see Dogman or Bigfoot or Elvis or something. And one of those things supposedly did happen to the person who sent us this next story called The Saber-toothed Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I think I may have witnessed the Dogman when I had a wilderness adventure with my wife back in the 1990s in Alaska. I'll just tell you what happened, and you can tell me what you think it was that happened to us. So, we had just gotten married, Deirdre and myself, about 2 years prior. She was starting to feel claustrophobic, and I was starting to feel taken for granted. We were both big fans of a short-lived TV show called Northern Exposure, and we decided that we needed a winter adventure in the wilderness. After all, the cold, snowy forests of Alaska looked so quirky and grunge rock and badass on TV. Of course it did. This was an entertainment fantasy show. marketed directly at people in our then demographic. It was designed specifically to blow smoke up our behinds, and we had bought into it hook, line, and sinking feeling. When we arrived in Alaska, nothing was as promised, and nearly everything was a bait and switch. We thought we were going to be going on an Alaskan hunting expedition with about a dozen other tourists like ourselves. We expected it to be mainly a vacation, where we could get an idea of what a hunt would be like and speak to an actual hunter and that sort of thing. We were led to believe that we'd be sleeping in a comfortable hotel each night, though. Instead of all that, somehow we ended up having to take 2 different tiny scary airplanes to a place called Petersville that I had never heard mentioned before. There, we met with 2 very intimidating men, who I will just call Mr. A and Mr. B. Mr. A was over 6 feet tall. Mr. B was taller than Mr. A. Neither of them were unfriendly, exactly. They told us we would be going on a hunting trip with them through the wilderness in Alaska. There would be nobody else along on the trip, and we would be roughing it, camping wherever we found a patch of land along the way. We were told that if we did every single thing we were told to do, to the very letter, and as soon as we were told to do it, then we would probably get through our adventure alive and in one piece. We were reminded that we had signed a waiver in case we got hurt or didn't survive. That was news to us. Had we done that? We had signed some paperwork. I couldn't remember what it said. I hadn't paid close attention at the time. My wife and I protested that this was not what we had paid for, and we demanded to be brought back to civilization. We were told that the plane wasn't coming back for a week, and they were going hunting. We could come along, or we could fend for ourselves in the Alaskan wilderness for a week waiting for the plane. We went with the 2 men. It was exhausting and grueling. My wife spent most of the time crying, and the rest of the time swearing that she would get even with me for this. At one point, she even promised that she would punish me from beyond the grave through 7 generations of reincarnation. She was in a very bad mood about how things had turned out, and I couldn't really blame her. I'll cut to the point you've been waiting for me to cut to. We were putting up the tents and preparing for the night when we heard a snarling and a growling kind of a sound that we hadn't heard before on the trip. I looked up toward the trees in the direction I heard the sound, but I didn't see anything. The growling would come and go, and each time it was from a different angle in the evergreen woods around us. Something was circling us and growling. I was visualizing a bear, to be honest. I kept looking at our 2 great hunters, and they didn't seem concerned, so I figured I shouldn't be either. This went on until it was fairly dark, and I became concerned enough to ask one of the men if he knew what that was circling around us. Amazingly, he claimed he hadn't heard the growling. Taking out flashlights, both men started shining them at the bushes around the edge of our camp. I was very surprised when they both zeroed in on a dog face, very low to the ground, hiding behind a bush or a shrubbery or something. I had expected a bear, and I had expected the animal's head to be farther off the ground. And then suddenly, it was. The dog head seemed to pull back into the darkness momentarily, and when both flashlights found it again, it was a good 7 or 8 feet up higher off the ground than it had been before. And then we saw something that was even more incredible than what we'd already seen. The dog that was now reared back on his hind legs, standing probably even taller than the tallest bear, Well, that dog, he had teeth almost as big as tusks. It looked like a saber-toothed Dogman to me, but I don't know if that's even possible. I know that big cats and even deer have sometimes had saber-toothed versions throughout Earth's history, but I don't know if this was ever supposed to have happened to a canine. If I saw something else and not a saber-toothed Dogman, what else did I see? It was definitely a dog head and not a cat head or a deer head. The body was wider than a deer, and the fur was that of a dog, not that of a deer. One of our two great wilderness guides fired a shot off in the air to scare the big, upright cave dog off. Instead, it dropped to all fours, barking angrily and advancing on him. Thinking quickly, I grabbed some rations that I thought a dog would want to eat, and I threw them to the creature. It ate all of that, and then we threw whatever else we had over to let him eat that too. I think we had trail mix and water left when the dog wandered off into the woods finally and left us alone. The two geniuses stopped arguing with us about heading back after that, since we really had no choice anymore. It turns out they were in radio communication with one of the pilots the entire time, and were just being jerks about not taking us back. When we got home from Alaska, we had a lot of stuff to sort through in terms of our marriage. It wasn't for some time afterward that I started to think back on that upright dog with the saber teeth. Was it a Dogman? I saw it stand. But, I did not actually see it walk on its hind legs. When it advanced on that man, it was back down on all fours. It seemed to be comfortable doing either. I don't remember about its front paws as I was looking at those teeth. They seemed impractical to me, the teeth I mean, extending past the chin the way they did. How could it bite or chew? Is it possible that we saw an extra large wolf that just had abnormal teeth? Maybe it was a mutation or something like that. Maybe he was the only one that looked that way. But it didn't look like a mutation. Both teeth or tusks matched each other. It looked like he was supposed to have them. So, what did we encounter? Giant Alaskan wolf or Dogman? And how to explain the saber teeth? I'm actually grateful we encountered the beast because it finally brought that vacation from hell to a close. We might have been out there for days longer if it hadn't been for the saber-toothed Dogman. The Princess Lodge Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Have you ever heard of Dogman being in Alaska? I think I may have seen one there, but the description doesn't seem to entirely match what I hear in most of the stories on YouTube. This was 2 years ago when my wife and I were celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary. We had been avid hikers and campers in our younger years, so we wanted to get out into nature somewhere. However, we hadn't been camping in over a decade, and we wanted a comfortable indoor location to sleep in at night. When my wife suggested we go to some place in Alaska called a Princess Lodge, I thought that was fine. I didn't really know what to expect, but I figured if they're calling it a Princess Lodge, it must be comfortable at least. I just wanted us to be able to pick one day to go off by ourselves into the wilderness surrounding the lodge. Just a few hours hiking along a trail, maybe a little canoodling with each other when nobody was looking, then back to the hotel before dinner time, just to remember what it felt like to be out there alone in the trees, surrounded by nothing made by man. So we went to Alaska, and we stayed at this lovely little lodge that had a view of Mount McKinley. It had a nice feel to it, although basically it's a hotel, similar to every other hotel. We were treated well, but I felt almost as though the staff were a bit overprotective of us. Maybe it's for insurance reasons. I suppose it would be more than inconvenient if customers met a bad end while in their care. We found out that they wanted to only allow hiking that was supervised so that nobody got hurt or lost in the woods. That was understandable, but disappointing. Being old hands at hiking, however, we managed to sneak off on our own when nobody was looking and go hiking on a trail we found out there anyway. It was a very special day for us, and we were quite happy to be heading back a little later than we had originally planned on returning. The sky was growing overcast and dark, and it looked as though it might snow or rain soon. Neither my wife nor I had heard about such a possibility. We had chosen that day to hike because the forecast said it would be sunny all day. We quickened our pace and got a little more serious about returning to the hotel. Fortunately, it was high enough above the tree level that we could occasionally see it off in the distance. Made it harder to get lost and easier to get back when you can see the hotel from all angles. The next part of the story is hard for me to tell each time I get to it. I froze when this happened, and my wife sorta took over. That's hard to admit to. We once lived in a home that burned down, and on that night I carried my wife to safety. I was called brave by people that night, although I certainly didn't feel it. When this next thing I'm about to tell you about happened, I was not brave. I was the opposite of that. I was a coward. I let my wife down. I have no explanation for why I was brave the first time, but froze like a block of ice the second time. Thank God my wife was there. I don't want to give her real name, but for this story, I'll call my wife Melba, because without her, I would have been toast. Melba was walking in front of me, and she stopped short and screamed a very short little scream, like the world's shortest scream, almost an "oh" kind of a thing, but very high-pitched and clearly frightened. She took a step or two backward and bumped into me as she did so. I nearly lost my balance. As I righted myself, I looked up to catch a glimpse of what Melba had been reacting to, and that was when I froze up. It was as though we had been out in nature for hours, experiencing the beauty of Alaska, and then I looked up, and I was walking into an old episode of Circle of Fear, or maybe a surrealist experimental film. There was a man standing in front of us who reminded me of a native shaman in a costume for a big dance ritual. The thing that was different was that this outlandish and wild costume was organic and real and seemed to move as though it were a living thing. The dancing shaman had a dog head, or maybe a wolf head. I guess you could say it was like a head of a jackal. Its mouth was open, though distended by overly large fangs. The top ones protruded through the bottom lips, and the bottom ones did the same on the top. It was a bit the way a wild boar's tusks look, but then again it was very different. This was not a pig or a boar. This was definitely a canine. I stood perfectly still, unable to move, barely able to breathe. I watched the thing, and I suppose that's good because I can tell you what I saw. I did nothing, and my wife may as well have been alone as be with me for all my actions mattered. This creature had thick, thick fur. It had hairs every single shade of gray, both warm grays and silvery grays. It had dark brown and black shades of fur, and it had white shades, especially around the mouth and the absurdly oversized teeth. Its eyes glowed a painful golden color that was hard to look at. Although clearly a dog, it had no tail. It danced in front of us, or maybe it was nervous, gyrating. In my frightened and frozen mind, it was dancing and deliberately entrancing us like a hypnotist from the wilderness. I was already trapped by it, I was already its puppet. I probably would have joined it in its dance soon, but my wife started making a racket, and I awoke from my semi-shocked state. She was slamming a rock against a tree and cursing a blue streak at the Dogman or whatever it was. And then it ran off into the woods. Melba grabbed me, and we raced past the spot, not slowing down until we were back around other human beings and feeling safer. I think I had let my guard down too much when we were out there, and that's probably why I froze when I should have acted. I think I was too relaxed, and you don't relax in a wilderness. Maybe you can do that in your virtual reality version of the Alaskan woods, but not when you're really out there. Being so close to the hotel, I didn't become conscious of the fact that I was in danger until it was almost too late. When I think back now of how we snuck around the hotel employees, so certain that we knew better than they did, I feel a bit embarrassed. After all, this was the exact kind of thing they were trying to protect us from. The vacation we took at that Princess Lodge in Alaska ended up being something different than we had expected or bargained for. I'm glad we went. We both are. It wasn't all fun and games, though. We both got a new sense of the fragility of life and our own mortality. We both got reminded that life isn't always about making ourselves comfortable. And we got taught a lesson in humility as we were forced to admit that we don't always know better than those around us. And all of this happened specifically because of the Princess Lodge Dogman. We've got a special story tonight, which was requested by our executive producer, and her name is Kathy Barrickman. So smart she's into polymathy, cause she's the one who's known as Kathy. We all need our Kathy Barrick, man. Without her, we'd be like a car wreck, man. Thank you so much, Kathy, for supporting the show and for leaving us such cool comments. If you want to be lauded and praised like the real original Kathy Barrickman, just become a channel member by clicking the join link below or by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. Then you, like Kathy, will get to see our secret Sunday uncensored stories, all far too wild to show on this channel, and our archive of them is now up to over 10 hours. So if you really want to support the channel, that's how you can. We also appreciate you clicking like, telling your friends, becoming a subscriber. Everything helps, and we all thank you for whatever you can do to help. And now, as I mentioned, this is a story specially requested by tonight's executive producer, and the title of this tale is The Werewolf of Westerly. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you that I guess is about the Dogman. Maybe it was about a werewolf. Are you sure there's a difference? I apologize in advance if I sound bummed out. I should be grateful to be alive after what happened to me, but I don't suppose I actually am. Maybe I'd have been better off if I hadn't survived. Again, I apologize if that sounds dramatic. This is still an open wound, and it still hurts. I guess the worst part happened about 6 months ago, but I've had little to do since then except sit in quarantine and think about it. I find myself lost in thought about what once was and what could have been. I have dreams that everything is okay, but then I wake up in my family's home, still confined to this area. And once the health situation begins to return to something more normal, assuming it's ever allowed to, I'll have to create a new life for myself out of the ashes. The ashes that have been sitting around for a half year already. It felt like a cruel slap in the face when this happened, but the health situation has kept me back on that day. Kept me inside the feeling of these horrible things that I'm about to tell you of. if you don't agree with me that this is one of the most terrible things that can happen to a guy, then you probably either haven't been in love, or else you may be too old to remember what it's like to be gripped by it. I grew up around Westerly, Maryland, although I didn't always live there. Olivia, not her real name, grew up there in a house at the edge of town. Her house was on a crowded suburban block that looked like something out of a Steven Spielberg movie. The Perfect American Block and The Perfect American Girl. We liked each other since we were teenagers, but we always seemed to be dating other people. There was one time that I went on a group date with her. I brought my girlfriend and she brought her boyfriend, plus there was a third couple. She and I ended up talking just sort of by accident. We had more in common than either of us had with any of the others. For one thing, she knew a lot about monster movies, and she knew even more about cryptids. She was pretty too, so I swear I felt the first real love feelings I felt in my life that night over her. Later on, she admitted that was the night she first realized she wanted us to start seeing each other. We didn't actually do it until almost a year later, because that's just how life works sometimes. I got into the habit of driving my beat-up old hand-me-down car over to visit Olivia when we were both about to turn 21 last summer. We would make a point of sitting with her parents for a while to convince them that we weren't up to no good. Then, we would be dismissed to go out in the backyard. From there, we would jump the fence and be in the forest over there in the Patapsco Valley. Sometimes, we would stick fairly close to her family's house, but other times, we would go on adventures past the Baltimore National Pike and Miller Run, heading deeper toward the Patapsco River and that state park over there. This became our personal Garden of Eden, and we spent that summer of 2019 enjoying the hell out of it. I could become a millionaire, but I'll never again feel as free and as happy as I felt that entire summer, thanks to that girl. So as the weather started to get chillier and we knew our summer was coming to an end, we were both a little sad. We started spending more time indoors watching horror movies. She liked werewolf pictures the best. She would always cry when the monsters were killed in the end. That seemed kind of weird to me, but at that time, anything she did was cute as far as I was concerned. We had a day that was a little less cold than the others, and she talked me into going back out into the valley as though it were still summer. I guess I whined too much for her taste, because I saw her look at me with disappointment in her eyes for the first time ever. I knew at once how badly I had just messed up. I was the summer to her. She loved me because I was the summer, and for me to whine that it was too cold outside meant that I had now become the autumn. She didn't love the autumn. I changed my mind and I said yes. She acted like she didn't want to do it anymore, but I talked her back into it. She tried to seem enthusiastic, but as we jumped her parents' fence and walked back into the woods, it felt forced and redundant. There were more leaves on the ground than on the trees, and there was more conversation in our past than on that evening. We walked silently because every time I tried to say something, it was the wrong thing to have said. I began to relax into the sound and rhythm of us stepping on the loud, dry leaves as we walked. Over and over, the same audio pattern repeated until it became somewhat entrancing. And then there was something else. Some other kind of percussive noise. Someone else walking on leaves at a different pace, coming from a different direction. Olivia stuck her hand out at my chest level, forcing me to stop walking. She was staring off in front of us. When my gaze joined hers, I could see the most stunning thing on planet Earth. I saw, literally backlit by the full moon, up on land slightly elevated over ours, a 6.5-foot tall werewolf, just like the kinds from the better movies. It was kind of like dog soldiers, but The chest was wider and more man-like. It was entirely covered in fur that ranged from black to silver, and it stood still and tall on its hind legs, surveying the scene in front of it. When its eyes looked toward ours, I was momentarily blinded by the bright glow emanating from them. I wouldn't call it eye shine because I was never blinded by that. This was a bright, painful light coming from its eye sockets. As I was still reacting to the burn of the eyes, the creature began barking at us, furiously and threateningly. Olivia grabbed my wrist and pulled me. I ran with her, rubbing my eyes as I went and half blind. We ran in a panic. I was never so frightened before. When we got back to her yard, I fell to my knees in tears of relief. Olivia stood waiting for me to get up for a while. It took longer than she expected it to, so she said good night and went inside alone. I didn't try to stop her. I just wanted to get in my car and drive home. We kept seeing each other through the winter, and she never told me that she wanted to break up, but it would be harder to make plans with her. She never wanted to go to the movies anymore, for one thing, and she never wanted to watch monster films at home either. She would sometimes ask me if I wanted to go in the woods with her. It was the winter. It was snowy half the time, but still she missed the woods, and that seemed to be the only thing she wanted to do with me anymore. Besides it being cold, we had seen an actual cryptid there. The only way I would have wanted to go back was with an armed guard and a film crew. Eventually, I gave in to her requests and consented to go for a walk through the snow in the woods behind her house. It sounded like it might be romantic, and we hadn't had much of that between us since seeing the Dogman on that night. What were the chances we would see the monster 2 times in one lifetime? And so I found myself in my overcoat and with my high boots on, trudging through a foot or more of snow in that forest. This would have been in February of this year. The quarantine was going to happen soon, but not just yet. I tried to make conversation, but Olivia kept moving more quickly than I could through the snow. I got the impression she'd been coming out there a lot by herself lately. It was an overcast day, dark, and I got chilled to the bone pretty quickly. I was shivering, and it made me stutter when I spoke. When I mentioned this to Olivia, she suggested that I not speak then. I was beginning to feel alone, staring at her back, constantly remaining one stride ahead of me. I was out of breath, trying to keep up with her, and I wondered when she had become a better athlete than I was. Olivia stopped, and once again she put her arm across my chest to stop me, as she had that one time before. I became filled with fear, and that coupled with the cold to make me shiver uncontrollably. It felt like all the blood and heat had drained out of me, and that I was going to freeze to death from horror. I looked, and sure enough, there was the big Dogman again, surveying the woods in front of him. Once again, his eyes burned into mine painfully, but this time, I knew to look away faster. "Let's go," I said to Olivia, reaching out blindly for her hand. "No," she answered me. "You go." What did that mean? I blinked my eyes, furiously trying to be able to see clearly again. The Dogman was not barking at us the way he had last time. Why not? I looked around for Olivia and I did not see her anywhere near me. It was then that I saw her near him. She had walked to the Dogman. Was she insane? I shouted her name and I thought about running after her, but the thing I saw next made me feel ill. She melted into the monster's arms, and I watched as he nuzzled her neck gently with his long, dagger-like teeth. And then those teeth bit in, and I thought I was witnessing him ending my girlfriend's life. I was seeing no such thing. She did not die on that evening, except in a sense. He held her as she gyrated, seemingly ecstatic, as her body transformed in front of me. She grew fur, and teeth, and claws. She was becoming as he was, so I guess he wasn't a dogman after all, but a werewolf of some kind. I turned, and I walked away from there, giggling. The whole world seemed so funny just then. Werewolves are real? My girlfriend dumped me for a werewolf? I think I went insane for a while there. It was an awful lot to assimilate. At least, I didn't get frostbite. That would have been a bummer. So, I went home, and I fell into a catatonic state, sitting in my room, staring at the wall. I lost my job, and my mom wanted me to see a shrink. But I just needed to grieve in my own way. One morning, as the quarantine approached, I realized things were over between me and Olivia, and I wanted some of my movies and games back that I had left in her room. Instead of contacting her, I emailed her mom because I wanted to come pick them up when Olivia wasn't there. It was too early for me to see her yet, I felt, but I wanted those movies back before we were all going to be quarantined. So, this is whenever that happened, March or April or whatever, I don't remember. I drove to their house, and as I turned the corner onto their block, I saw Olivia hanging onto the back of a Harley-Davidson as a tall guy with long hair drove off with her. Was that the werewolf? I guess it must have been. I wondered what her parents thought of that guy. Then I realized it didn't matter. Olivia loves the summer, and dating a werewolf means that it's always summer. I can't compete with that. I found that I am no match for the werewolf of Westerly. We want to know if you think this all could have happened or not. Maybe it's a true story, or maybe we're all being punked. You tell me about this narrative that the submitter has entitled The Dogman of Hop Hollow Drive. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a whole lot of stories about Alton, Illinois, and Southern Illinois in general that I have spent a lifetime gathering. I had planned on writing a book, but now I feel too old to take on a big project like that. It's fun for me to write them down one at a time, though, and I'd love to hear you read them on your show. Maybe if I live long enough to tell you most of the stories, they can be collected into a book after I'm gone. Either way, I'd like to send you this one story at least. It's brand new. It just happened to my granddaughter last week. And so, it's a COVID-era Dogman story. Most of my stories took place in the 20th century, so this one is the exception that proves the rule. My granddaughter works for UPS and was delivering a package out to the end of Hop Hollow Drive in Alton, Illinois. If you're not from around here, that won't mean anything, but to people my age from this region, Hop Hollow Drive is a name that resonates and sets off alarm bells. You see, although it's located in a nice prefab suburban community these days, the old winding Hop Hollow Drive was once a dirt road twisting and turning through the woods, heading to a cemetery for prisoners. Back a century earlier still, an area of ground had been set aside as a Confederate cemetery, although it was not officially designated as such for some time afterward. When a nearby prison needed a place to bury deceased inmates, the land adjacent to the Confederate graveyard was suggested and donated for the cause. Over the decades, rumors began and persisted that the prison guards were becoming increasingly lazy and had begun burying the prisoners all over the forest, sometimes just covering them with branches and leaves and then partying for the rest of the time that it would have taken to dig the hole for the body. It became known as a haunted region, and although I'm sure real estate people will slap me down hard for saying this, there are more than a few who still regard Hop Hollow and the forest region beyond it as very haunted even to this day. But I'm not going to tell you a story about a ghost, no. I'm going to tell you a story about the Dogman. My granddaughter was driving out on Hop Hollow Drive one morning, like I said just last week. It was a dark morning. It still looked like night due to the cloud cover. She told me that she felt uneasy, which she knew was absurd due to where she was. Now, this is a very nice place to live. Each house, as she describes it, is like one stately Wayne manor after the other. Beautiful houses, well-off families. Everything is perfectly manicured, safe, nice. Nothing to fear. And yet my granddaughter found herself shivering all over. So she pulled over and stopped, going over her information and looking for the package she was meant to deliver to one of the houses over there. While she was doing that, something caught her attention out of the corner of her eye. Looking over, she said she saw a dog, something like a German shepherd, but standing on its hind legs and looking at her from the woods. Her first impulse was to whistle for the dog to come over. Unlike many delivery people, my granddaughter loves animals of all sorts. She can usually charm even the most savage beast. In our family, we call her the dog whisperer. But in this case, when she looked into the eyes of that dog, she saw something that froze her and wiped the smile right off her face. The uneasy feeling came back full power, and according to my granddaughter, that was when the dog charged. Now she had thought she was seeing a dog standing up so it could see her delivery truck better. She had thought it must be leaning on something in order to stand up like that. But what she saw next changed her mind and released enough adrenaline into her system to power her through a decathlon. What she saw was something out of a nightmare. She saw that dog charge her on his hind legs. All thoughts of the delivery she had to make forgotten. My grandkid kicked her truck into drive and began making the U-turn she was going to need to make before she could get away from the impossibly large bipedal guard dog charging toward her. She said it was making all sorts of unhappy dog sounds, just freaking out and sounding deeply offended by her presence. Her passenger side of the truck had a wide open window that she was not going to be able to close in time, and sure enough, the creature slammed into that side of the vehicle, reaching in one long front arm, swiping around, trying to scratch her as she drove. I asked her what its claws looked like, and she said it had normal dog claws. It was just a dog's arm, not a monster arm. Possibly its claws may have been a bit longer than those of a house pet, but not significantly. This was some kind of a feral dog that somehow had the ability to walk bipedally. Its body was shaped like a dog for the most part. It was not shaped like a man in a dog costume or a Bigfoot with a dog face or anything like that. It was a dog that was able to walk and even run at fairly high speeds on its hind legs. Screaming and cursing a blue streak, she has apologized to me and our pastor for since then. My granddaughter swerved that truck back and forth until the dog thing lost its grip and fell off the side. It soon regrouped and chased her bipedally at first, all the way to Holland Avenue. When she hit Holland, there was no traffic, and so she floored it, going well past the speed limit in an attempt to put some space between her and the Dogman. At that point, she told me, the creature dropped to all fours and was able to run at a higher speed. It wasn't able to keep up with her for long, though, and so she got away. I was concerned that she was all right after hearing this. If she gets traumatized about delivering packages, she won't be able to earn her living. However, my granddaughter is nothing if not conscientious and steadfast. She told me she waited for the sun to come out. Then she drove right on back to that location and delivered the package before her shift was over. So, even though the Dogman tried to take her life or at least scare her off, all he managed to do was delay the inevitable. The package got delivered anyhow. That's why now my granddaughter will only deliver packages to that area while the sun is out. She has no special desire to ever again lay eyes on the Dogman of Hop Hollow Drive.
Boo!
Dr. Death, what's your deal, man?
You act like scaring someone to death is somehow wrong.
Why are you here anyway?
Why am I here? I promised to come back and read another story. I'll be back later in the program with a story so scary that it'll turn your entire world into September in less than 24 hours.
Is that a threat or a Oh, he's gone already. Well, stay tuned for Dr. Death's 1980s Dogman story coming up later in the show. Right now, I want to announce that today's episode is executive produced by Jim Mooney. Jim Mooney. He's no loony. He helps us produce all our scary cartoonies. You can't pull the wool on him because he's our EP Jim. We couldn't do it without cool dudes like Jim Mooney, so we all owe him a little thank you. If you would like to have thousands of people feeling grateful to you as well, all you have to do is join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Either way, you'll get an all-new uncensored scary story far too wild to run on this channel every Sunday night, plus access to our over 10 hours of uncensored archives. This first story tonight was sent to us by a father who was concerned about his young son. This is not a story for young children or any kind of children. Be forewarned in that regard as I tell you the tale that we are calling the Mr. Potato Head Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story to tell you about the Dogman, and it makes me angry to do so. My wife is making me write you in order to force me to eat my own words. I never believed that any cryptids existed. My prejudice on this subject ended up placing my family at risk they should never have been placed in. I'm lucky that nobody got hurt, and the worst thing that happened to me is being forced to write this email to you. We could have ended up the victims of the Mr. Potato Head Dogman. This only happened 6 weeks ago, right in the middle of the entire virus thing that's been going on. We were only able to find a new apartment to move into last week, and we've been spending over a month in motels and on relatives' couches. It's been a hard time, but things seem to be getting better, so now is the time for me to tell you the entire story and see what you and your viewers make of it. Going back to either January or February, our son had been claiming he saw Mr. Potato Head outside of his bedroom window at night. This was when we still owned our own one-story cottage over on the countryside of the suburbs. That house and property are still on sale. If we ever sell it, we may be able to buy another house someday. Until then, we'll be happy in our 2-bedroom apartment. So as I said, our son would tell us over breakfast each morning that he had seen Mr. Potato Head outside of his bedroom window again the night before. We were amused by this, my wife and I. We had gotten him Mr. Potato Head for Christmas, and we were quite happy that he was still playing with it into the next year. You've ever had a kid, you know the interest level in toys drops off significantly after the first day, or the first few minutes, really. They cry for the toy when they see it on TV commercials, but once it's in their hands, it can become boring very quickly. So, every time he told us that Mr. Potato Head had been outside his window again the night before, it made us happy. and proud as parents that we had made a good toy choice. One day, we heard a crazy sound coming from our son's room. We're both working from home most days, at least for now, and we both ran to see what was the trouble. We found him playing with his Mr. Potato Head and pretending it was howling. Then he made barking sounds and played that the Mr. Potato Head was scaring his toy soldiers by barking at them. He made the toy soldiers run away, and then Mr. Potato Head gave them a speech about how he was the best, and then he howled again. My wife and I watched this scene, then looked at each other, and we shrugged our shoulders simultaneously. What was the meaning of that scene we had just witnessed? It was confusing, but it wasn't alarming to us. My wife gently asked if Mr. Potato Head could use his inside voice, and our son started giggling uncontrollably. I asked him what was so funny, and he told us while chuckling that Mr. Potato Head doesn't have an inside voice because Mr. Potato Head lives outside. Again, we chalk this up to the surreal nature of how kids' minds work. No alarm bells were going off yet for either one of us. We had a relative over one day when our son was playing with his Mr. Potato Head, making him act like a big dog again. The relative quizzed him about this and got laughed at the same way as my wife and I had gotten. How ridiculous that relative was not to know that Mr. Potato Head lived outside and acted like a dog. Our son was beginning to think all adults were a bit silly. We were definitely regarding him as our little eccentric by that point. So finally the fateful night came when I was putting our son to bed and my wife was in our room staring numbly at her phone like a zombie as usual. While tucking him in, he got excited and said something to me to the effect of, "Look, Daddy, there's Mr. Potato Head now." I turned, laughing, not really expecting to see anything at all. But I saw something all right. I saw a man-like figure outside that I couldn't see the shoulders of as he leaned down to look into my son's bedroom window. How wide is an average window? This was a normal-sized window, but the individual beyond it looking in made it look like a toy window in a dollhouse. My son applauded and cheered as I stood to full attention, my jaw practically hitting the floor as the man-thing leaned down even further, allowing his head to be illuminated by the room lights better. This man had a head with a long snout, like a dog. I had thought he was a man with a deep tan, but now I could see that was fur. Tan fur. He had very thick tan fur covering all of him that I could see, which was obviously only a percentage, maybe a third. The muscles on the monster man were like those of an Olympic weightlifter. He looked strong enough to just push his hand through the wall and walk on in. I think he would have had to stoop over to walk around inside. He was that big. It would have been comically easy for him to push that window in, but it might have been harder for him to squeeze his massive frame through the window opening. I realized my wife had been talking about Dogman for years and I had been laughing at her, but now the joke was on me. That was an actual Dogman outside the actual window. I grabbed my son in his blanket and left the room, locking his door behind us. I knew the lock would be a joke if the Dogman actually decided to come in and chase us. It'd be able to push down any door in that house on its first or second try. My son was cheering and having a ball as I tossed him on our bed and locked the bedroom door behind me, panting. My wife didn't even look up from her phone, just mumbling something about how I shouldn't throw the kid. I got on the phone to the police and started telling them there was a prowler on our grounds and asked if she could send someone over. My wife told me to stop talking so loud. She was trying to read her friend's Facebook post. My son was jumping up and down, screaming in happiness. When I got off the landline, our son began celebrating that the police were coming over. He He loves cops for whatever reason, so this was his big night. My wife eventually got annoyed enough to ask why I had called the cops. I told her that Mr. Potato Head was a dogman. She glared at me and went back to staring at her phone. I took the phone away from her, pulled her suitcase from the closet, and tossed the stupid phone inside. I told her she had 5 minutes to pack, and then once the cops got there, we were leaving for a motel. She screeched at me that I wasn't making sense and asked me why we needed to leave. I told her again why. Because Mr. Potato Head had turned out to be a dogman. She admitted to me later that she thought I was talking about Dogman from the Dave Pilkey children's books, the cartoon Dogman, not the werewolf-like real kind. So she was completely out of the loop, and as usual, we have Failbook to thank for that, the most utterly evil creation in the history of humankind. My wife told me that we couldn't leave home without bringing a change of clothes or two for our son. I told her I'd come back for his clothes when the sun was up, but she was hearing none of it. She marched over to our son's room, unlocked the door, walked in, screamed at the dogman still standing outside the window, then locked the door, came back to our room, and started lecturing me that there was a dogman outside. The police arrived, and as one rang our doorbell, the other searched our grounds and found nothing. I asked the officer at the door if he could cover us while we made a beeline for our car. He asked where we were going to, and I told him I was going to get out on the highway and then Google for motels in the area. He told me he'd be happy to give us a police escort to his wife's brother's motel. He told me the rates were fair and it was the safest place to stay. Sleep where the families of the police sleep and you'll be sleeping soundly, he told me. I suppose that might have still been true as recently as then. So, we got a room in the cop's wife's brother's motel, but I couldn't sleep at all. We ended up exchanging it for a room up on the second floor. I didn't feel safe on the ground level. I kept feeling like that big dogman was going to stare in through the window at us at any moment. I couldn't picture him climbing the stairs to the second level to bother us, though, so I finally got some sleep when we went up there. In the morning, everything felt silly. The idea of a werewolf scaring us from our home seemed like a bad dream while the sun was shining. My wife started reminding me how difficult it would be for us if we had to move from the place we hadn't finished paying off yet. As I went back there in the morning to pack up some of our son's clothing and toys, I wondered if I was being ridiculous. Then I turned, and for a split second, I thought I was seeing the monster there again, and I jumped. I was as scared as I had been the first time I saw the thing. I felt vulnerable and frightened all over again. It was an illusion caused by markings on the window. When I looked closer, I could see that the markings were on the outside of the glass. It probably was markings left by the creature itself. In a sense, I really had seen it there for a second. So, I think our son called it Mr. Potato Head because this dogman was so round. I don't mean he was fat. I mean his muscles were so huge and balloon-like that he was very round. He was big, brown, and bulky, and I can understand why my son associated him with Mr. Potato Head. In retrospect, it doesn't seem all that crazy. And I don't see how we could have guessed what he was talking about without seeing the creature for ourselves. I have to wonder why the monster was coming to visit our son at night. What was his interest in him? He could have broken in and taken him any time if he wanted to. Was he waiting for something to happen before doing that? If so, what was he waiting for? If I had never seen the creature that night, would he have continued visiting my son for years? Or would something terrible that I don't even want to think about have happened suddenly one night? And if we had no idea that Mr. Potato Head was actually an immense dogman, then how would we have interpreted our son's sudden disappearance? Or worse, I get shivers just thinking about it, so I'm going to try not to. It's going to take us years to recover financially, and who knows how long to recover emotionally from the Mr. Potato Head Dogman.
The Grandmaster Dogman, as read by P.Q. Ribber. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Back in the 1980s, I was the manager of a breakdancing troupe which I would get sued if I named. We got pretty big. I say we, but I never danced a step in my life. Those guys had all the moves, but any cash they got, they spent before thinking. I saw how they were blowing it and convinced them to make me their manager. Smartest move they ever made. Without me, they never would have gotten anywhere. Like, for instance, the gig I got them performing down at a festival in New Orleans. We took the bus down there and got situated, but the pay was far less than we had been promised. Plus, they expected us to pay for our own food. We got angry, and there was a bit of shouting and carrying on. Eventually, we agreed to perform for the lower amount, but we went out onto the streets to busk for dinner money. That is, I had the guys go into their act on the sidewalk while I collected donations from the crowd. I had no idea where we were, but it was at the very edge of town, apparently. New Orleans was a place none of us had been before. We had no idea about its history with black magic, and we had no warning that there was a dogman living there by the name of the Loup-Garou. All I know is that the guys were performing and the crowd began to thin out. That had never, literally never happened before during one of our shows. People would always gather around tighter as we went on. The crowd would usually get larger and larger straight up till the end. Not that time. People kept leaving and they had this weird look on their face when they did, as though they were frightened. I knew they couldn't be scared of us because we were all super friendly, but I didn't know what else those facial expressions could possibly mean. Then everyone took off, some of them shouting like they were terrified. I was completely confused by all of this, and I turned around in frustration. What I saw there behind us caused me to scream too. There was a man, or maybe a wolf. It looked like a wolf, but it walked like a man on its hind legs, and it was walking from the bayou or swamp outside of town on up to the show. It had its eyes on two of the crew who were on the mat, spinning. The other guys saw what I was seeing, and they ran off like the crowd had. Before the two spinning dancers knew what was happening, that dog-headed man was barking at them and racing in circles around them. It ran on all fours. In fact, I think I was the only one of my crew that saw it walking upright. I know some of the crowd must have seen him walking like a man, but to my dance crew, this was a very large and mad dog. It snapped at them and barked as they flipped acrobatically up and out of there. We ran away and went back later to retrieve our mat. I know New Orleans is a great place. Everyone says so. We had a horrible time, though, because of the Loup-Garou. And another thing, Dogman has no rhythm. That's something I learned from the Grandmaster Dogman.
Blessed are those who mourn. When I was away at college, my parents both passed on suddenly in an accident while they were away on vacation. I suddenly had to come home and become an adult, dealing with lawyers and accountants and real estate people. One of my parents' lawyers seemed to be running the show, and he presented me with paperwork which would allow him to sell the family's old house out in the country while moving my name onto the lease of the Manhattan condo. I actually requested they sell the apartment and allow me and my dog Becca to move out to the country for a while. I don't think the lawyer liked that idea since he was centered in New York, and it would have been easier for him to have me there than in the woods of Pennsylvania. And I might not have made that choice if I had known it would lead me and my poor dog into such a terrible encounter with the Dogman. First of all, I want it clear that I am not rich. Just because my parents technically owned 2 homes doesn't mean we're rich by any means. I have friends who think that being a millionaire means you're rich. There are YouTubers who are millionaires. My family left me very little in liquid or spendable cash. That was one of the main reasons I opted to take the house and sell the apartment. The house was paid for. The condo was going to cost me monthly payments for maintenance. It was also worth 15 times what the old house was worth, and so selling it should allow me to live cheaply out here in the woods for a good long time. I mean, I'm not a layabout. I do work for a living, but it's a good feeling to know that if I suddenly can't, for any reason, I've got my home, and I've got money in the bank for food and home repairs. When I first moved out here to Pennsylvania, I was only going to take a few months off with Becca the sheepdog, and then figure out a way to finish college. I only had 12 credits left, so even if I didn't go back to where I had been studying, I still assumed I would get those credits in some manner at some point. So there was an air of the temporary about our visit out to the house. Becca and I had spent some summers there in my tween years, and I think we both enjoyed the nostalgic feeling of being back. It was almost like my parents were still around. We could kind of pretend they were back in the city and we were on vacation. It helped ease the mourning. Becca and I were as closely bonded as a dog and a person can be, and those days walking in the woods surrounding the property were the most fun days we ever got to have. Which is why I guess when I found her that morning outside, or I suppose I should say I found her remains, it changed me. I was not going to be able to pretend my parents were back in the city any longer. They were gone, and now so was my sheepdog and my best friend. I knew what had happened to my parents, and I knew it was an accident. I didn't really understand what had happened to Becca, but I saw that it was murder. And I saw that it had been done by some kind of animal. What kind of animal could do something like this to a sheepdog in her own backyard? It had to have happened fast for me not to have heard it happening when I was only inside the house. Something came and quickly killed my close friend for no apparent reason. I went and got my grandfather's old Winchester out from his room upstairs. He had shown me where everything was kept when I was young. He told me there might come a time when I might need to defend the house. I went to where he showed me the ammunition was, and it was all covered in dust. I didn't, and still don't, know much about such subjects. I don't know if dusty weapons work at all, but I got the thing loaded, and I went outside, and I sat down on the ground next to my only friend in the world. And I cried. I would never get to spend another single moment with Becca, and I had to bury her, but I needed to be with her for a while longer before I could do that. And I didn't know if what took her so cruelly would come back and do the same for me, so I was armed. That was about all the sense I could make out of the world as I sat there and cried. I cried for poor Becca. I cried for my parents, and I cried for myself, who was going to have to move forward with the horrible pain of knowing that all 3 of them were gone permanently. I sat, I squatted, I knelt, I laid on my side, but no matter how long I was there, I simply could not stop crying. And then I heard a sound that sent adrenaline surging through me, and I came at once to a very complete kind of attention. I had been wondering if I would sink into a depression and lose the will to live, but that question was answered by my adrenaline flow. I clearly still had an urge to survive, even with my family stripped from me and nothing but uncertainty ahead. So I looked into those dark woods, knowing somehow that this was the same thing that had attacked my sweet dog. Maybe it was coming back for seconds. I armed myself, and I got ready to fire if anything came out of those woods. There was no other noise for some time. It felt like I was waiting for minutes, but maybe it was only 30 or 40 seconds. Time seemed to have slowed to a stop. I pulled away from the scope and looked around with my naked eye. That was when I saw something that I couldn't make any sense out of. There, under the cover of the trees where almost no light at all creeped in, I could make out two very tiny lights. They looked like fireflies, but the orange kind, not the greenish ones. The thing is, the lights were not flashing on and off. They were on full time. It took me a while to find them again using the scope and to move in looking more closely. Again, it looked like I was seeing two lightning bugs remaining perfectly still. But then, they both blinked off and back on simultaneously, and I understood that those were not two insects. Those were two eyes. I rose instantly in shock and fear, aiming my weapon in that general direction. My movement seemed to have startled or alarmed whatever that was as it came charging forward. The way it advanced so quickly reminded me of a documentary I had once seen about gorillas, and I thought I was being charged by a Bigfoot, to be honest. But when the thing burst out of the foliage and into full view, I could see very clearly in the moonlight that this thing was some kind of oversized canine. It was wolf-like, but larger than any wolf I'd ever seen. Its head had to have been 5 feet off the ground, and then it reared back on its hind legs, growling loudly, and it began to walk toward me bipedally. I was more than a little stunned by this turn of events, as you might expect, but somehow seeing a giant dog walking toward me woke me up. I realized I had backed away from the remains of Becca and that the bipedal canine was advancing toward her. This filled me with rage and disgust. Taking a few insane steps forward to put myself between her and the monster, I took aim just above the wolf-headed man's eyes, and I shouted at him to back off. He didn't. I fired, barely missing him, and I shouted even more loudly for him to back off. I heard him leave more than I saw it. He exited so quickly, I don't think he had ever witnessed a shotgun blast from close range before. It put the fear of man into him, I hope. I was no longer naive enough to rely on hope, though. I spent a large amount of the proceeds from the apartment sale to erect electrical fencing and security cameras around the perimeter of my property. Burying my parents and best friend in so sudden a way had reshaped me into a person who no longer had any patience for taking chances. It's been almost 11 years since then, and the only things I've caught on trail cams are interesting local animals. Nothing scary, nothing that we didn't already know was there. No Dogman, no Bigfoot, no chupacabras. I used to get an occasional bird fried on the electrical fence until I just turned that thing off. Personally, I think the cameras scare off the Dogman by themselves, and the fence really isn't necessary. Those upright canines are smarter than your average bear, and they will not go where they know you have a camera trap. Same with Bigfoot. There might be a way to trick them, but we don't really know how they sense the cameras now. If we can figure that out, then maybe we can build a better camera trap. But until then, we can at least keep the nasty monsters away from our loved ones by surrounding our homes with enough of the motion-activated cameras. If something like this story happens to you, and you lose those that you care about the most, don't feel as though the world has turned against you. Understand that the world is actually conspiring to teach you things that nobody else can know. Remember always what the Sermon on the Mount teaches us. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So, what do you think? True or not? While you're pondering that, I'd like to tell you about executive producer Dave Rabbit. Being generous is his habit. We get Henry Lee Dogman to behave with Scooby snacks, which are paid for by Dave. Please join us in thanking the grand and marvelous Dave Rabbit for helping to keep our show on the air. And if you'd like to help us attempt to survive, you can click like, subscribe, or click that join link below this video. That gains you access to our Sunday night secret uncensored scary stories. The Dogman Expert. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I considered myself a Dogman expert. In my opinion, I knew everything there was to know about the Dogman. I knew all the different kinds of Dogman, and I would let you know everything that I knew. I would shove it down your throat, to be honest. I used to go around to blogs and podcasts and YouTube shows about the Dogman, or shows that even mentioned the Dogman in passing, and I would lecture. Oh, how I would lecture. I would let you know what you got wrong, and I would inform you of what you should have known but didn't. I was the dictionary definition of a know-it-all, and I must have been difficult to get along with. I didn't care at the time, though, because I was basically in love with myself and the sound of my own voice. If people disagreed with me, that was a clear sign of their own stupidity. They couldn't know something I didn't, since I knew everything that there was to know. Simple, see? That was what life was for me. Simple. And then, one night, all that changed. I saw something that shouldn't exist, and it sort of cracked my persona. It wrecked my ego. It destroyed my self-confidence. I saw a kind of Dogman that I had specifically told 3 different YouTubers and 1 prominent blogger does not exist. I staked my reputation on this kind of Dogman being nothing but a myth. Now that I've seen it for myself, I can never go back to being the person that I once was. I don't know if Vic Cundiff's 7 variants on Dogman is copyrighted by him or not, so I don't know if I'm allowed to make direct reference to it on your program. I accepted 6 of those 7 types, and I also knew of a few varieties of werewolves, although those aren't really relevant to this particular story. One of Cundiff's varieties, the Type 3 Variant 3, I accept the reality of, but I classify that one as a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The one I adamantly declared a hoax or misidentification was the one that looks like an upright hyena. I had a good reason to disbelieve in that species or subspecies, and I'll explain my reason to you. Back about the year 2003 or 2004, I attended a Comic-Con on the West Coast. I went to dozens of them between 2002 and 2006, traveling all across the country to do so, and they kind of meld together in my memory as one big, long con. I remember it was a warm but not hot day, and I was hanging out in a natural area behind the convention. It was a medium or small con, not one of the really big ones. There were some cosplayers nearby, joking around with each other. I was alone, just wanting to get some fresh air. I think I was drinking a bottle of water or eating some junk food or something. Then this other cosplayer came over out of the forest and sat down on a rock across the way from me. He had the sickest costume I ever saw. It made my heart beat fast when I first saw him emerge from the woods wearing it. I thought for a second that I was seeing an 8-foot-tall monster walking out of those trees, coming to shed its fur all over me. It had a hyena head, and I thought that whoever was in that costume must be the tallest man on the planet. Then the hyena man bent forward and put his claws to each side of his head. He looked like he had a bad headache, but I figured he was having trouble getting the mask off his costume. I was about to rise and walk over there to help him out, but 2 friends or accomplices of the hyena man emerged from behind him, and together the 3 of them removed the head and neck of the beast. It was then I could see a man, a tall man, but not more than maybe 6 feet to 6'3" maximum, standing there, the bottom half of his costume held up by suspenders over each shoulder. He had appeared so tall because the mask was not only the hyena head, but its neck and shoulders too. He must have had eye holes somewhere in the neck that I hadn't noticed because I hadn't been looking for them. I got up the nerve to go over there and talk to the 3 of them briefly about the costume. I asked if it was a character from a movie or a show that I had missed, but they all told me it was something they made up themselves for a found-footage horror movie they had been shooting together for over a year. They told me they would stage events where unsuspecting members of the public could see the guy in the costume from a distance, so this way they would wonder if they saw a real monster. The idea was to get people around the country to believe that such a thing existed, and then it would be a natural viral way to promote their movie without them having to spend a dime on advertising. I thought that was very clever, and it stuck with me as the years went on. Whenever I would hear people talking about seeing one of these kinds of dogmen, I would laugh and sneer, feeling that I had the inside info on this thing, and I knew for a fact that it was merely a guy in a very well-designed monster costume. As I've already recounted, I was frequently arrogant and condescending when informing others that this creature was a hoax. I didn't understand yet that it's not possible for one person to know everything. The years were kind to myself and my life partner, and we both moved to San Francisco in 2014. With the way things have gotten this year, we both decided it was time to go live someplace other than California. I'm not going to get into where we're moving to, but it is to the east of California, as everything is in these United States. And it was as we were driving east that I had my encounter that completely changed everything about who I am. It was my turn driving, and it was the middle of the night when the engine conked out. We were in Montana, but where in Montana, I can't tell you. I know this was only 4 or 5 weeks ago, but to me, Montana was on the way to where we were going, and I'm afraid I wasn't very present in that moment. I was annoyed at having to leave San Francisco, which I had never planned on ever doing, and I was a little frightened about expenses since we were being forced to spend money we had planned on saving for retirement. So my mind was on the past and the future, and I was regretful about one and anxious about the other. When the engine died, it was just another annoying interruption as I rushed madly toward a future that was imaginary at best. The future never exists. It can never exist. When it finally arrives, it's the present. Only the present moment is real, and I was angrily trying to avoid accepting that. Sometimes you need to have a mythical monster show up in your life and slap some reality back into you. So my partner handled calling our service as I wandered into the woods out of the light of the highway to take a whiz. As I walked into the darkness and allowed my eyes to adjust to the lack of light, I began to notice a figure lighter than the background moving around further into the woods. I felt as though I recognized it, and my mind went through its old Rolodex, trying to sort out what those movements reminded me of. Once I finished my business, I wandered a bit deeper into the forest, quietly, trying to get a second look. It was that Hyena Man costume I had seen the guy wearing years earlier at that convention back west. It had to be that same costume. It looked just the same. A very tall man-shaped furry creature with a long neck and a hyena-like face. It was a lighter color, most likely a tan color, but it had darker spots in the fur. Its ears were pointed, but almost more cat-like than dog-like, the way they were further to the sides of the head than is usual on a dog's cranium. I looked around for the guy's two friends. I wonder if they were filming him there in the dark. Maybe they were using night vision or something. Then again, maybe they were back on the road, waiting to film him coming out of the woods. I was amazed that of all the places in the world, these guys would end up right near where my car's engine conked out. Overcome by the synchronicity of these events, I got over my shyness and I made my way through the woods toward where the cosplayer was. I called out to him, telling him we had met once before at a Comic-Con in California. He turned toward me with a kind of speed I had not ever witnessed before in my life, and my initial thought was, they've made some improvements to that costume. He adopted an angry pose and exposed a row of fangs the costume did not have back at the convention. He emitted a growling sound unlike anything a human could make. My body turned and ran back toward the road, as my mind was still adding 2 plus 2 and figuring out that this was not a cosplayer. This was some kind of a real creature. I ran for my life, crying out for my partner and sounding truly pathetic and weak. I couldn't believe that voice I was hearing was my own. I began to accept that this might be the end. I might not make it back to the safety of the car. This hyena man might catch me. How ironic would that be? "It's not ironic at all," shouted a voice in my head. "It's just one of our enemies out to scare us and make a fool of us. It's someone in a costume." "Shut up," I told the voice. "That doesn't even make sense." The voice in your head sometimes thinks the world revolves around it, but this wasn't my story anymore. This story now belonged to the angry, snarling, cat-like Dogman chasing me through the woods. And then I tripped over something and I landed hard on the ground, nose first into the dirt. I had the wind knocked out of me and my face was in a bit of pain, so I wasn't going anywhere. It hurt too sharply to even think for a little while. I could hear the beast approaching, but it wasn't like I could do anything about it. I apologized to my mother in my head, and I accepted what was about to happen. Then I heard what sounded like a firecracker, and my ears rang for some time after that. A highway patrol car had stopped when they saw us pulled off to the side of the road. The patrolman had been chatting with my partner when the two of them heard me calling out pathetically from the woods. Running over to investigate, the officer fired his weapon once in the air, and the monster gave up its pursuit of me. My partner explained that to me later on, after enough of my hearing had returned, and I was out of my state of shock. I never did get to ask the patrolman what he saw chasing me through those woods. My partner called it a bear. I had told him that wasn't a brown bear, and that wasn't a black bear. And so he said, well, then it was a grizzly bear. They do have grizzly bear in Montana, I believe, and grizzlies are scary monsters to be certain. But what I saw wasn't any kind of bear at all. It might have been a kind of hyena, or a kind of cat, or a kind of dog, or a kind of man, but I have to admit, I just don't know. All I know is that it was for real, and that I've been wrong all these years. I've learned my lesson. Never again will I refer to myself as the Dogman expert. Today's executive producer, so I hear say, is none other than Annabelle Duarte. We couldn't do the show without dear Annabelle. Our executive producers are really all so swell. If you would like to support our channel and get to see our secret uncensored Sunday stories, just join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join link below this video and become a channel member. Once you're done with that, come back here because we're about to tell you our second creepy story of the day, and we call this one The Strange Man in My Aunt's Home. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When the quarantine started, I lost my job that I had just gotten used to. My aunt invited me to come stay at her place as a hired hand, and she would pay me. Most days she promised would be my own, but when she needed things done around, she would expect me to help out. I had met her a total of 3 times in my life at family gatherings, and I'd never been to her home before, so although I was hopeful, I wasn't sure what to expect. Of course, I had heard stories about her home and Aunt Esther herself. She was the one rich relative. She was eccentric, but she was generous around the holidays and was generally well liked within the family. I saw her house a good 20 minutes before I pulled into the parking area in front of her mansion. The house is near the top of a tall hill. It's an old-fashioned looking mansion that you would assume from a distance was the home of the Addams family. I got shivers, thinking it would be my job to clear away all the cobwebs off the big stuffed polar bear. Or maybe a fire-breathing dragon lived under the staircase like on the Munsters. When I carried my luggage inside and found no cobwebs, it was a huge relief. It didn't even smell in that musty way that many old houses smell. If I didn't know better, I would assume the place had been built in my lifetime, but in the style of many years ago. That's how well kept the place was. I remarked on this to Aunt Esther, who laughed and told me that the further you climb up or down from the main floor, the more cobwebs you'll find. So, besides the main floor, with the kitchen, dining area, etc., there was a second level filled with bedrooms, and a third level which seemed to be made up of library rooms and a billiards room. There were glass cases with labeled oddities inside them, almost as though the third floor were a museum as well. I knew of 2 basements in the place and was told by my aunt that they were all I needed to know about. She implied that there were at least 2 more levels going deeper into that very tall hill, and I realized it wasn't just Aunt Esther who was eccentric. So were her husband's ancestors, and so was the house that they had left her. So, one day while exploring the 3rd floor, I came upon an older gentleman in an old-fashioned suit. He was seated in an antique chair and reading a volume of Dickens. Although I was surprised to see him there, he certainly seemed as though he belonged, so I calmed myself before becoming alarmed, and then I introduced myself. We shook hands, and he introduced himself as the librarian. I explained my situation, and he seemed quite friendly and welcoming, offering to be my guide or assistant whenever the need arose. We chatted, and soon he was guiding me from room to room, from ancient glass case to ancient bookshelf. I got to see things that don't officially exist because they aren't in museums. They're only on that 3rd floor of that strange home on top of that tall hill. I got to see first printings of all the classic novels that I knew the names of, and others I didn't. I got to see a skull of something labeled a werewolf. I have no idea what it actually might have been, but it sure looked like what it was labeled. One room was almost entirely taken up by a huge glass-topped table. When I got close enough, I saw a skeleton preserved under that glass that must have been 12 or 14 feet long. It had a human-like skull, but so big I felt I could have worn it as a helmet. The librarian not only explained each item to me, but he explained the provenance as well. Some had been found or captured or dug up by family members, Others were acquired through mysterious and likely black market means. In our travels, I began to notice what looked like hatchways on the ceilings of some of the old library rooms. I had thought that was the top floor, but the librarian explained to me that each library had its own separate attic. That was because when the libraries and private collections up there were gathered, no member of the family trusted any other member. They all lived together, but despised each other. So the attic space was divided up into 5 separate areas, each with its own entrance. I spent more time with the librarian than I spent with Aunt Esther, and one night over dinner, I began to talk to her about him. It took her some time to communicate to me that she had no idea who I was referring to. There was nobody in the house, she said, except for me and her. The previous handyman had moved away as the quarantine began, which is why she hired me in the first place, just so she wouldn't have to be alone in case of an emergency. I told her that we had someone else with us in the house, and that if he was actually there squatting, we should allow him to stay anyway. I told my aunt all of the anecdotes that the librarian had shared with me, and her face featured a growing look of horror. I got the impression that she thought I had been talking to a ghost, but I assured her I had taken this gentleman's hand, and it felt like a real man's hand. It was not ghostly in any way. After some time more, I realized Aunt Esther didn't think I had seen a ghost. Aunt Esther thought I had gone insane. I told my aunt about all the different attics the place had and reminded her of the multiple basements. Couldn't a person be living somewhere secretly in the house? How would we even know? I could tell my aunt had grown frightened of me, and she clearly wanted to hire someone else and get me to leave. As a last-ditch effort to save our arrangement, I convinced her to come upstairs to the libraries and the private museum collections with me and to hang out for a while. If we wandered through all the collections and never ran into the librarian, I would leave the next morning. However, if the librarian were there, I would introduce the two of them. Hesitantly, she climbed the stairs with me, but she kept her distance. More than social distance. She seemed ready to run from me in a second if I went psycho on her. Poor Aunt Esther. On the 3rd floor, we went from room to room, with me pointing out various items and telling her the backstory of each. Aunt Esther's late husband had been the one to inherit this place. She herself had never known any of the people who once lived there and was not a blood relative to any of them. It was clear in her eyes that she did not believe any of the historical stories I related to her. I was only convincing her of my own insanity. Finally, we reached the last room, and I entered first. Seeing the librarian across the room reading in a chair, I let out a huge sigh of relief. "There you are," I called out, and he rose with a smile, closing his book and standing politely. I turned to Aunt Esther and ushered her into the room triumphantly. Formally introducing my aunt to the librarian, I turned to see that he was no longer there. Rushing to that side of the room, I looked behind things and under things, and I looked for a secret passageway that he might have slipped through. But nothing seemed as though it had been disturbed in the last 10 years or longer. I turned to look at Aunt Esther, and I saw horror in her eyes. She was looking at me, and I was terrifying her. I went to my room and I packed just as I had promised. So, I know I'm not crazy because I've had nothing else like this happen to me before or since. Was this man hiding somehow in my aunt's house? Was he in fact a ghost of a former occupant? If so, Then how was I able to shake his hand? And why did it feel the same as any other man's hand? All I know is that half of my family now thinks I'm crazy, and it's all because of the strange man in my aunt's home.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.